All right, guys, welcome to the stream today. We got a couple of different things to talk about. I want to get 3 segments in if we can, but one of them is going to be part of the Deconstructing the Church series. It's been a segment I've been trying to get to the last few times I streamed and just haven't. But I want to talk about a recent court ruling with a very large, very well-known church, Gateway Church, where Robert Morris was the pastor before the scandal and fallout that eventually landed him in prison, at least for a little while. They've had a big ruling in regards to that church in court. I want to take a look at that ruling, and I want to take a look at what that actually means for us and what we can learn about that, what we can learn from that as far as it goes in regards to court rulings, court documents, how cases are decided with churches. Because sometimes, guys, it can be misleading. And, if you're not a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert at all, but I see enough of these things. And I know for a lot of us, if we're not like a legal expert, you don't know somebody who's a legal expert, then a lot of times it's hard to make heads or tails. It's hard to make sense of what these court decisions actually mean, especially when it comes to churches. So I think there's some things that we can learn. And I think these things actually help us to continue having good, strong accountability conversations about the church. And today, I want to spend some time reacting to some things that a pastor recently said about NDA use. He was asked some good questions. He sat down and kind of answered rapid fire a lot of these questions in an interview with someone who I would consider a friend. And I appreciate the answers. I appreciate the questions. I want to drill down deeper into that, though, because I believe this pastor actually revealed a whole lot more than he realizes about NDA use in the church. Not saying it's all bad, not saying that he's evil or anything like that. I just think he revealed more than necessarily he meant to reveal. I think there's a lot that we can learn about it. I'm going to challenge the things that he said, not saying that they're all wrong, but in at least some of them saying, hey, I disagree with this. This is wrong. And others to say, there's a gap here. There's something you said and it sounds good. Here's the truth of what happened. There's a gap. We've got to explain that gap. And honestly, I just appreciate this conversation, though, and I don't want to just completely dunk on this pastor the whole time. I want to ask good questions, but I want to ask them in good faith. I don't want to dunk on this pastor the whole time because very few pastors are willing to sit down and have a conversation this long about NDAs. Most of them, they're not going to answer anything about NDAs, or they'll answer one question here or there. So I appreciate this discussion. And if we have more discussions like this publicly, more discussions like this out loud, I actually think it would help us to bring a greater level of reform to NDA use in churches. One of the reasons why we haven't seen that reform is there's not a lot of us having those conversations. And those that are, they're talking heads like me. Maybe they've been inside the church, but they're not inside the church now. If we really want to reform NDAs and severance agreements in such a way that they are kingdom focused, that they help everybody, that they're only protecting the confidential information we need to protect the people, and that they're not silencing anyone, the only way I believe that we get there is if we're inviting pastors, and especially influential pastors of large churches, into these conversations. So that's going to be the third segment, kind of what I want to talk about. We'll probably talk about that one second. We'll start out with some of the court cases, this Gateway court case and its dismissal and what that means, lessons learned, and then we will try to finish with the third or the next part of the Deconstructing the Church series. Today, we're actually going to talk about the sacraments. We're going to deconstruct the 2 major sacraments, baptism and communion. And we're going to say, hey, let's just take all those Lego pieces that we have, those ideas that we have about what baptism and communion are, and those experiences we have about what those are. Because for many of us, we've only known one way to do these things. Maybe you've grown up in different denominations, different traditions, and you've seen these things done a few different ways. But for most of us, we haven't seen that. We've only experienced one thing. So it can be hard to take those Lego pieces, those experiences, and put them out on the table and say, those may not be right. But what we're going to do that, and we're going to look at baptism, and we are going to look at communion, the Lord's Supper. We are going to look at it the way that a first century Christian would have actually looked at it. We're going to go back to scripture and just really dial in on this in a way that you probably haven't heard anybody else do before. And I don't say that because I've got some special knowledge. There's no special knowledge here. It's just in this process the last few years of doing my own deconstruction and reconstruction, I've laid out everything on the table, and I've had to go back and take those theology degrees and say, hey, even the stuff that I learned in school, I got to put a lot of that on the table. And then I got to take these skills. I got to go back to scripture. I got to go back to first century history, and I've got to build a biblical blueprint first. And then when I understand what the church is, when I understand these things that Jesus taught from a first century perspective as best I can, then I can start asking questions about why we've added what we've added, what I want to hold on to, what I want to let go of. Because when I say what I want to let go of, I'm not talking about I'm letting go of things just because I don't like something the Bible says. I'm talking about what I want to let go of because I can't justify it biblically. And maybe it's getting in the way of me actually following Jesus in the most God-honoring and biblical way. So that's probably what we'll do for the third segment. But with that said, let's go ahead and get into it today. As always, feel free to leave comments. Feel free to leave questions. You can always leave something live, but you can also always send us something in the mailbag. You can send us an email. You can leave us a recorded message. The information on how to do that is in the description below. Hopefully, toward the end of the summer, we're going to be able to do a couple more mailbag episodes where we can just hear from you and I can answer your questions. So if you got a question and you don't want to ask it in the chat today, you can ask that, and you can ask to remain anonymous through the mailbag. Or if you want to ask a question today, or you just want to share your thoughts, concerns, we always enjoy being able to share as much of those as possible on the live stream today. So I'll try to look at the chat in between each segment and share anything that you guys are sharing, answer any questions that you have. I'll try to actually interact as much as possible. So if you've got something that you want to ask, whether it's on topic, off topic, go ahead and let us know in the chat. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get into segment number one. And let's look at this lawsuit, this recent decision that we have with this gateway lawsuit around tithing and what we can learn from that. A judge has ruled in the gateway tithing case. There are members who brought a case before the court and said, Gateway Church, the church that was pastored by Robert Morris for decades before his scandal broke out and he ended up in prison, they said, hey, this church misused our tithing dollars. They told us that a certain percentage of all tithing money was going to go to Jewish missions, and it was going to go to missions across the globe. And that's where we thought it was going to go. And they misused it. And the people who brought this case, they brought all kinds of stuff from fraud to RICO charges. They had a lot of deep allegations, and we have a decision from the court. It's not the decision that a lot of people would have expected, but the decision brings a lot of nuance, and I have seen a whole lot of confusion around this decision and what it means. So today, I want to break it down for you the best that I can as a non-legal expert, as someone who just has to deal with these court decisions a lot in my research and my reporting, to help you make sense of this, heads or tails, and to help you to understand another reason why why we have a hard time holding churches accountable, why the institutional church can't escape accountability sometimes when everybody may look and say there needs to be accountability right there. There's still some tools and levers that they can pull that at times are going to help them escape accountability through the mechanisms that maybe we would normally try. And one of those is court. So let's go ahead and talk about this decision. What is the decision that the judge made? I'm going to go ahead and pull it up because I want to show you. I'm going to show you a couple of different articles here. This first headline comes from the Christian Post. It says, lawsuit alleging Gateway Church and Robert Morris misappropriated tithes dismissed. And that word right there, dismissed, is bringing a whole lot of confusion. I'm going to tell you why here in just a second, because a lot of people, when they see a case dismissed, here's what we think of. Okay, here's what I would have thought of a couple of years ago before I started spending as much of my life as I do today reading court dockets and court decisions and everything else like that. Okay, when we hear dismiss, we tend to think, oh, well, if the judge dismissed this case, there's no evidence. This was a frivolous case. There's not enough evidence to move it forward. So actually, that's the worst kind of case loss that you could get, because if you had good evidence, maybe you could take it before a jury and you would lose in civil trial. But if the judge dismisses it, he's dismissing it before it ever gets to trial because there's not enough evidence to make it stick. That's what most of us think. So when we see things like that this suit was dismissed, we think that Gateway won. Here's another article headline from the Roy's Report. Gateway Church wins tithing lawsuit dismissal as federal judge cites First Amendment. Now, while that is technically correct, again, it's misleading. And I don't think anybody from the Roy's Report meant it to be misleading. I just know how people hear this. And when we say Gateway Church wins, we think, oh, they won the lawsuit. Really, all they won was a dismissal. They won by getting a dismissal. They don't have to go to court. They didn't win anything on merits. And often when we think about winning a lawsuit or losing a lawsuit, what we're talking about is, did they win on merits or lose on merits, which could happen in really one of two ways. The first way is the judge could look at it and all of the pretrial stuff and say, there's not enough evidence here. The allegations aren't going to fit the law correctly. There's something wrong procedurally with this. Whatever it is, this can't go to jury trial because something is wrong. So I'm dismissing it on merits. So because it has lack of merits and it doesn't have everything, every box check that it needs, I'm not sending it to jury trial. Judge could say, I'm advancing this to discovery and jury trial on merits because it has merit. It has a likelihood to succeed. So I'm going to move this on. Now, the other way this decision can come is actually when you actually have a jury trial, okay? And it could be something like the jury comes back and they say, we find the defendant guilty, okay? We find them guilty on merits. Or they could say, we find the defendant not guilty. Based on the merits, there's no merits we found to find them guilty, okay? So normally when we think about somebody winning a case or an organization winning a case, we think if they won the case, it was found that either there were no merits to the case or there was good defense given. That's not necessarily what happened here. And let's look at one more because I want to show you one more way this has been couched that is very misleading. And this was just something I've seen going around on Facebook. I'm sharing it from Aubrey White, but Aubrey White is not the only person who has shared this. I think this was an actual headline, but I couldn't find it. But they led with the headline, a federal judge just ruled that you have no right to know where your tithe went. A federal judge just ruled in this Gateway case that you have no right, I have no right to know where our tithe went. And guys, headlines like that are incredibly misleading. That's not what the court decided at all. They weren't deciding anything about our rights as parishioners. So I want to show you why this is misleading to say that this case was dismissed, why it's misleading to say that Gateway won this case, and why it's very misleading to say that a judge ruled that we as Christians, we as parishioners, we as church members and congregants have no right to know where our tithe actually went. So let's go ahead and let's talk about what happened here. We're going to go through the Roy's Report article together, and just to give you a better idea of what is going on here. It says, a federal judge dismissed a class action lawsuit accusing Texas megachurch Gateway Church and former senior pastor Robert Morris of misrepresenting tithing expenditures, marking a significant legal victory for the scandal-plagued congregation. Now, again, this was a legal victory in that they got the judge to say, you don't have to go to trial. You don't have to go to discovery. Okay. So it was a legal victory in that way, but it wasn't a legal victory in that the judge or a jury looked at their case and said, you're right. And these plaintiffs who are trying to bring a class action lawsuit against you, he's not saying you're right and they're wrong. We're dismissing the case. You're winning, they're losing because they didn't have good evidence. And it's found that what they said wasn't true. That's not it at all. And we'll talk about why here in just a moment. I want to give you a little bit more background here, though. On June 23rd, U.S. District Judge Amos Mazant of the Eastern District of Texas ruled that the First Amendment's ecclesiastical abstention doctrine bars courts from adjudicating internal church disputes. The ruling dismissed all claims brought by the plaintiffs. They alleged that Gateway leaders promised portions of church tithes would support missions and Jewish ministries, but diverted them elsewhere. Okay. Now, what is important about this? What is important about this? The reason this case was dismissed was not because Gateway and Robert Morris were right and the plaintiffs were wrong. It wasn't dismissed because of a lack of evidence from them or because the allegations they were making didn't have merit. Okay. Actually, when you look back, Gateway has already requested that this be dismissed before. They made a previous motion for dismissal, and the judge didn't grant it. Why did the judge not grant it in that case? Because the judge said, hey, there's actually a lot of stuff here for us to look into. All of this is not based on church doctrine, theology stuff. A lot of this is about things that the legal system, the civil legal system can look at. So no, I'm not going to dismiss your case. Let's go ahead and prepare to go to discovery. But if the plaintiffs want to amend the complaint, they can still do that. And if the defendants want to amend their motion, they can still do that. So what happens? Gateway amends their motion and they bring a new motion. That is this one. So they've already had one motion for dismissal that was denied. Why did this one get accepted when the other one got rejected? Well, this time they came back and amended it, and they amended it by citing a case from, I believe it's 2024, 2025 against the Southern Baptist Convention. And they used that case determination to cite, hey, ecclesiastical abstention. This is church stuff. And based on previous precedent, not just recent precedent, but precedent for the long haul, we've got precedent after precedent after precedent of courts saying, hey, because the First Amendment, we're not going to get involved in theological and doctrinal disputes. We're not going to tell churches how to govern themselves. So we can deal with an issue of the law when it comes to a church or a pastor, but we can't adjudicate anything. We can't hear anything in front of this court that is going to make it to where, for us to come to a decision, the court, the judge, the jury has to decide theological, doctrinal, or ecclesiastical matters. So when you see ecclesiastical abstention, that's what it means. So this right here, ecclesiastical abstention, comes from the First Amendment. It's basically saying we're not going to get involved. The government's not going to get involved in churches, telling churches how to govern themselves, what theology they should believe, what doctrine they should teach, and things like that. So what does it actually mean that they dismissed this because of ecclesiastical abstention? It means that the judge basically looked at this and said, based on their amended complaint, there's valid things to look at here. There's lawful things to look at here. These allegations have enough merit to send this to discovery, to get people deposed in depositions, and if the two parties can't find a settlement in that process, to go to a jury trial. He's already said that, but what he's coming back now is he's saying, based on their amendment, I don't see a way we can adjudicate those things without also having to make decisions about ecclesiastical governance, about doctrine, and it's things like this. He's saying, hey, there's no way we're going to be able to make decisions about this without deciding information about tithing and the practice of tithing. And that is a doctrinal issue, and the court is not going to touch it. So this is actually a good decision. This is a decision a lot of people are not going to like. I would have liked to have seen a lot of this stuff come out in court because it has the appearance that there is a likelihood of malfeasance. And I would have liked for that to have been cleared or found in court. But as someone who cares about the First Amendment, who cares about the government not telling churches what to do, or not telling any of us really what to do, right? Wanting to limit the government's power in that way. As somebody who cares about that, this was a good ruling, even though I don't like the outcome. Okay. Now there's other things that they can do. They may make amendments to their complaint. They may file a different lawsuit. They may file an appeal, but generally courts have just been very clear. We're not going to get involved in ecclesiastical, doctrinal, theological disputes, these sort of issues. So this is a reason why churches often, big churches especially, don't have to answer for potential wrongdoings. They don't have to answer allegations in court. The reason is because any church with a smart attorney is going to look for a way to frame this under the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine. Because if they can say, judge, in order to deal with this, you're going to have to make decisions about my doctrine, my beliefs, my theology, my ecclesiology, my church governance. If you're going to do that, if we're going to take this to court, you're going to have to do that. And that is blatantly against the First Amendment. It's against just years and years and years of judicial precedent. Okay. So that's why it was dismissed. It has nothing to do with the merit of the case. This is essentially a court saying, hey, we're going to let the church take care of stuff in the church. We're going to let the people and the pastors, we're going to let the church take care of its own stuff as much as possible. So let's go back let's look at these headlines again. In that case, did Gateway really win this tithing lawsuit? No, they just won the dismissal. And that's what a lot of people are going to say, oh, they won the lawsuit. No, they just won their motion to dismiss. And it was really on that technicality, on that loophole, which is a good loophole. But just like anything good, it's good. Ecclesiastical abstention. I don't think anything needs to happen to it. But we also know that bad actors and sometimes even good actors will misuse or manipulate good things, good legal loopholes to avoid accountability or to avoid having to answer these kinds of questions. Okay. So the church is taking what's available there. They got it dismissed. But do you see how this doesn't feel like they won a lawsuit? And there are going to be some people, there's going to be some pastors who from now on, when people come and they ask them tithing questions, there are going to be pastors who say, hey, did you know there are actually some parishioners that took their church to court recently? They took their church to court and the judge said, you have no right to ask. Let's look back at this one. The judge ruled you have no right to ask where your tithe went. And if that's true for them, it's true for us, okay? Even the judicial system, even the government has said you don't have a right to ask about that. So that's just not me being cagey as a church. It's just, hey, it's not something that you need to ask about. There's going to be pastors who say that. But is that what happened? They didn't win that lawsuit for that reason. The judge didn't rule anything about the right that you and I have to know where our tithe dollars went. The judge simply said a court, this court specifically, cannot hear that lawsuit because that's something that parishioners and their leaders, the church needs to take up within the church. The church needs to have those kind of hearings within the church. So that doesn't mean the judge isn't saying that you and I don't have the freedom to ask, okay? He's simply saying the court can't compel them to do that, okay? And I think this is actually a good thing as well, because if we as Christians would get better at having these conversations and we wouldn't take silly excuses or non-answers for answers, then we could actually get to the point to where we could have healthy conversations about this. And this should be the last resort, I think. But if you're tithing to your church and you're asking good faith questions, they won't give you any answers, then at some point, I think it's okay to say, okay, well, then I'm not tithing until you do. I'm not giving until you do. I'll give somewhere else, because if I believe in giving, then I am going to give somewhere else. I'm still going to be generous, but I'm not going to give here until you're willing to answer some of these questions. And if that's the case and enough people do that, then the church is going to start answering those questions, or their financial bottom line is going to hurt because not enough people are going to be giving because they're avoiding accountability. So I think this just points us back to the courts are not always going to save us. As the church, we, the body, have to hold the body, including its leaders, accountable. You have to hold me accountable. I have to hold you accountable. There's accountability that has to come from the body. But the judge didn't rule that we have no right to ask where our tithe went. He just said, I can't ask that question and adjudicate it in court without dealing with theological issues. He didn't say Gateway Church wins on merit. I'm dismissing it because they won the lawsuit. He's saying, no, I'm dismissing it because the courts aren't going to get involved with the church. Okay. And then why was it dismissed? This is really important. Again, the majority of the time we see something's dismissed, there's something wrong with it. When we see a case is dismissed, there's not enough evidence, there's procedural problems, there's this, that, or the other. Okay. But that's not always the case. And a lot of times with churches, the reason why a case gets dismissed early, okay, the two most common reasons a case is going to get dismissed early is going to be either one, ecclesiastical abstention, or two, an out-of-court settlement. And when you get an out-of-court settlement, you go back to the judge, you say, we got this settlement. If you'll sign off on this settlement, you can dismiss the case. And often, too often, we will have people frame it this way, whether it's pastors inside the church, just Christians within the church, people outside of it, reporters, whatever. Too often we will have these things framed as, oh, this lawsuit was dismissed so that the church won. Okay. And you'll hear pastors, we're going to hear one a little later in another segment, talk about frivolous lawsuits and people bringing frivolous lawsuits. And how do we know they're frivolous? Because they all got dismissed, right? Okay. We have to ask deeper questions though, because it is possible for a lawsuit to get dismissed and it not be frivolous. It's very possible for it to get dismissed on ecclesiastical abstention. And if they cannot get that, then it's actually the most likely outcome you're going to find in court. The majority of civil court cases are never going to end up in a jury trial. No one's going to win or lose them. the majority of them are going to be decided by out-of-court settlements. And when there's an out-of-court settlement, it's dismissed. And this is how not only churches, but big companies and corporations, millionaires and billionaires who have lawsuits against them, it's how many times they can say, oh, there was a lawsuit, but nothing came of it. Nothing came of it because it was dismissed, and it was dismissed because of a settlement or something like that. It wasn't necessarily dismissed on merits. Okay. So it's important for when you hear that something was dismissed, people will often use that as, hey, the courts have decided this already. Even the courts are on our side because look, we won this case. You got to ask deeper questions about it though, because a lot of times it's not quite what it seems. And if you want to go back and you want to read that full Roy's Report article, you want to read the church leaders article, the Christian Post article, there's tons of them that are out there. But what you're going to find in each one as you actually read it and dive down into it is this was simply stopped, not because there's not question about Gateway's use of tithes, not because there's not concerns and allegations about fraud or misappropriation of funds. Okay. But the one kind of court win that they've gotten so far has been, hey, we're going to hide behind the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine. You can't get into these doctrinal disputes. Now, I think good arguments could be made, and a lot of lawyers are not going to know how to make them because they've never been inside the church, like as a pastor and stuff like that. But I think there's actually good arguments that could be made that this isn't actually an ecclesiastical issue at all. It's not a doctrinal issue. It's not a theological issue. And I believe that there is a high likelihood that they could actually come back and get this into court in some other way in the future, or somebody else could. But that's not how the arguments got made today. So again, it's just important that we know when we hear there's a lawsuit against the church or a lawsuit against the ministry, if it gets dismissed, that doesn't always mean that the church won. Okay. Just like on the flip side of that, that doesn't mean that the people who brought this suit against Gateway, that they would have won if it wasn't for ecclesiastical abstention. All we know is that the judge before this had said, hey, it looks like there's enough here for this to play out in court and for a jury to decide. We're going to have to go through the discovery process. We're going to have to get more evidence, but there's enough here. So when you get a case that's dismissed, we don't actually know who was right and who was wrong because it was never actually adjudicated. Okay. So that's important. The next time that you hear about a church, a ministry, a pastor saying that, hey, there was this lawsuit against me and it was dismissed, the question is, okay, well, how was it dismissed? Was it dismissed with ecclesiastical abstention? Was it dismissed under a settlement agreement? Or was it dismissed on merits before the court proceeding started? Or when you say it's dismissed, are you saying that it was dismissed and there was no conviction, there was no there was no jury saying, hey, you got to actually pay up, but saying we don't see that there's a problem here. We don't find any guilt. Okay. Again, just got to ask those questions because it tells us a deeper story. And that's going to be important in our next segment as we talk about church NDAs. It's actually going to help us ask some better questions as we hear a pastor giving some answers to questions about NDAs that I think are a little bit misleading. I think are a little bit elusive. This is going to help us ask that question. So for now, what's going to happen with Gateway and this tithing issue? I don't know. I don't know if it's completely done in court or not. I think at minimum, there's probably going to be an appeal on it. But this is important for us to know. It's important for you to understand ecclesiastical abstention because there's good for this doctrine. I think a lot more good than bad in this legal doctrine. But this is a legal doctrine that a lot of churches are going to use as a shield against accountability. And if you read a few of those articles, actually called it a shield against accountability. So if you were to ever, and hopefully you don't ever find yourself in a place where you're in a lawsuit against the church, but it's important to know if you do find yourself in that place, they may use this doctrine as a shield. Interestingly enough, not a lot of plaintiffs against churches or defendants when churches are trying to sue defendants. Not a lot of people on the other side of the church who are usually Christians and usually a part of these churches. I don't think enough of us have used ecclesiastical abstention doctrine because it actually cuts both ways. And if you have a good argument for that, I believe that we'll see judges start to bring a little bit more of a nuanced approach to some of these things. But at the end of the day, we're not going to get the accountability and the reform that we need, guys. We're not going to get it from courts. Courts can help. Lawmakers can help. Things like Trey's laws are very, very good. court decisions or NLRB rulings like McLaren versus Macomb that said you can't use overly broad NDAs. Those are good. Okay. They are very good. But at the end of the day, the world is not going to save the church from itself. What we're going to have to do, if we want to see reform in the church and we want to see the healthiest church possible, it's got to be the body bringing accountability to the body. So I think the biggest questions that we could ask here is, if you're not a part of Gateway Church, it's going to be hard for you, difficult for you, if not impossible for you to bring accountability to them in this situation. But what we can do is we can have the hard conversations where we're at. Have you had uncomfortable conversations, but important conversations about church finances with your pastor? I know I've had those conversations with my pastor. I've even had conversations about what he makes and what others make, because he knows this is important to me. Okay. And while they're not going to maybe give every bit of transparency that I would want, I feel confident that I can go to my pastors, I can go to our church leaders, I can go to our elders, I can ask any question, and it's not going to be off limits because there's nothing to hide. I've had other churches where I couldn't do that. So that's an important thing to me going forward. And I hope it's important to you. Is we want to be a part of churches. I want to be a part of a church where I can ask those tough questions. And it's never going to have to go to something like court, because the body can still hold the body accountable. In the moment that the people of the body, the people in the pews, the people in the chairs can't hold the decision makers accountable, can't ask financial questions, in my opinion, there's something wrong. And the only reason this ends up in the courts to begin with is because for years and years and years now, as church members, we've given up authority to hold our leaders accountable, to hold the institution accountable. We've given that up, and we've said, we're going to give up more authority to our pastors, more authority to the church staff, more authority to others. And over time, we've actually lost that authority. When I was growing up, the majority of churches were congregationally led, which meant you had to have congregational votes on all big church governance issues. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. I don't think that's probably the best church governance structure. But again, growing up, I went from all I saw was, you're actively involved in governing your church if you are a parishioner, to today, that's rare. And in more churches than not, it is going to be a small group of elders. It's going to be the pastors and staff, maybe only the senior pastor in some churches, that are making these decisions. So I think the biggest lesson that we can learn from this is how we bring accountability to our churches day by day matters. The questions that we're willing to ask matters, because while a lot of us, we don't want to make the calls for our church day by day, it is important that we don't give up all of our authority to actually hold people accountable, because humans are going to human. We're all going to make mistakes. And if your church is going to allow everybody to have a voice and accountability, that's, even though it's going to be more frustrating at times, I think it's always going to be better in the long run. But hopefully the next time that you see a headline about a court case involving a church, you'll know some of the deeper questions to ask to make heads or tails of some of this crazy legal jargon and stuff and what's happening. And I hope that you can actually see in some of our other segments today, I hope that you can see how we can practically use some of these questions to really ask better questions about bigger topics, because this isn't just about individual court cases, but it really allows us to ask deeper questions and to see when some leaders are using things like this, saying, oh, well, nothing came of these court cases. If they're using things like that to potentially deflect from having a hard conversation, then we can actually see that and then ping pong the ball back in their court and say, hey, we're actually not done with this conversation. This is really important. So hopefully that's helped you to get some clarity on all of those issues. But that's it for this segment today. We'll be back with another video soon. But until then, grace and peace. I love you guys. All right. So that's it for segment number one. Definitely had some people with us, not a whole lot in the chat. Appreciate Abby being here. All right. Appreciate Shaman Way being here. We'll go ahead and get into segment number two here in a second, because these two kind of go together. But again, hopefully that was helpful, and you were able to find that interesting. I know some people, like, they hate the court stuff. They don't want to talk about it, but I think it's just important, because court and the legal system has its own language, and church leadership a lot of times has its own language. And a lot of times we have to break down the barriers of that, learn how to speak that language a little bit, just so that we can have the accountability conversations that we need to have. All right, but let's go ahead. Let me pull a couple of things up here and we'll jump into segment number 2 where we talk about these NDA issues. Did this megachurch pastor just reveal NDA secrets that churches hide, that churches don't normally tell us? And did he perhaps tell us a little bit more and reveal a little bit more than he even knows? The truth is, I believe every Christian should hear this conversation because church NDA use, and that's what we're talking about today. Church NDA use is not really a topic that Christians can afford to stay neutral on. The stakes are way too high for us to stay neutral. The damage done to people is too real to keep these conversations about church NDAs in the dark. Now, my friend Ruslan KD sat down recently with a pastor of a big church, a well-known church, 1122. He sat down with Joe B. Martin, the pastor of Church of 1122, and he asked him point blank about NDAs in churches. And the conversation, guys, I think it was really good. It revealed a whole lot of important information about church NDA use. But I think Pastor Joby, again, I think he may have told us more than he meant to. Now, Ruslan asked some good questions, okay? A lot of people when they're interviewing pastors, they're never going to ask this question because if you start asking about NDAs, you may lose the interview. And to give Joby credit, a lot of pastors are not going to answer this many questions about something like church NDA use. So I want to give both of them credit. Ruslan asked some good questions. Joby sat down, answered those questions, took one after one, and he gave some compelling answers. I think for a lot of us, there's answers that on the surface you go, whoa, that sounds really good. I found myself saying, whoa, that sounds really good. I want to believe that. That would be a great answer, okay? Now, while I wish that Ruslan had pressed him more, I get why he didn't. Okay. And I'm grateful that both sat down, they had the conversation. I'm grateful that Ruslan let me know about it when it was over. And he let me know about it, understanding that I would probably want to weigh in and that I would probably disagree with some of these things. So he wasn't hiding it. And for those that don't know, Ruslan and I actually met over a disagreement, a pretty heated disagreement over NDAs. It was a passionate conversation over church NDAs where I was calling out and challenging some stuff that he had said in a Q&A segment with some other pastors. But what started out with us on opposite sides actually became very fruitful. And it even led to one of his pastor friends who was a part of that panel removing non-disparagement clauses from their severance agreements entirely. Okay. So Ruslan, he takes that conversation that we had on the podcast, a lot of the conversations we had offline, there's things he says that lets me know he's taken that conversation with me and others like Mike Winger who have concerns about NDAs. He's taken that into this conversation, and he's also taking things that he has heard and learned from other pastors into this interview. Okay. Now, one big difference though between Ruslan and I think it's a good difference overall, is that when in doubt, because you're always going to have a moment where you're like, I don't really know what's happening here. There's a gap in understanding. This is what the pastor said. This is what I understand, what I know. There's a gap in understanding. How do I fill that gap? What do I do when there's doubt? When Ruslan is in doubt, he tends to lean to the side pretty heavily and of believing the best about the church and filling the gap in understanding with believing the best about the church or about the pastors that are involved. Now, I love the church as much as Ruslan or anybody else. I've given most of my adult life to serving the church. But because of my experiences in the church and because of the way that God has wired me, I tend to lean more toward critical questions and investigating truth when in doubt. So even if I like you and I like the answer that you're giving me and I really want to believe it, I'm not going to fill that gap with just believing the best. I'm not going to fill that gap with believing the worst. I'm going to fill that gap with, I'm going to keep asking questions until we find the truth. And again, if you find the truth, that's great. If people start evading the truth, that teaches you just as much. Okay. The big difference, if you want like kind of a picture of this, between the way Ruslan and I approach interviews and conversations like this, is Ruslan is going to be more of a defense attorney. Okay. He's asking questions. Okay. He's willing to ask hard questions, but he's asking it because he really wants to be able to defend the pastors and the churches. I'm more of a prosecutor. And that doesn't mean that I want to, just drop the hammer on these churches, that I want them to be guilty. That's not it at all. I actually don't want churches to be guilty of nefarious things. And I hope for the best in almost all of these situations, because I don't want to keep seeing these news stories and these scandals and seeing people hurt. But I also want to keep asking intelligent and critical questions until I can fill the gaps with as much truth as possible. With that prosecutor's mindset, I'm not trying to defend anybody. I'm not trying to convict anybody. I'm trying to find the truth. And if the truth, if the truth says, hey, there's no guilt here, that's awesome. Okay, it doesn't mean that I've lost. And if the truth says, hey, there's a reproach, that conviction can be brought here, I don't feel bad about that at all, because just like Jesus said in scripture, the truth will set you free. If we can pursue truth, I think it sets us free. So as we get into this, I don't want it to feel like I'm just dunking on Joby Martin. Okay, I'm going to try to enter this with as good a faith as possible, because I believe most churches and most pastors, man, they're God-honoring people. They're doing their best. They're not trying to be villains. So I don't want to be critical to try to prove that they're bad. I'm not trying to be critical because I'm angry. I just want to find truth and the freedom that it brings. So I watched this interview. I have some deeper questions. I have some concerns to raise. I have some challenges to bring. However, I want you to know before we get into this, I'm not bashing Ruslan because he didn't ask the questions I'm asking. If you're not in this world of church NDAs every day, and I'm in it almost every day, it's hard to even know some of these questions are things that you could ask, let alone should ask. I'm not bashing Joby or Church of 1122. I'm going to do my best not to assume any motives. I'm going to try not to assume that they're doing anything to hurt people or to hide something, but I am going to ask tough questions. I'm going to ask those tough questions in as good a faith as possible, and I'm going to hope for and believe the best until proven otherwise. But hoping for and believing the best doesn't mean I'm not also asking questions. I can do both at the same time. Now, also, I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to reach out to Joby and 1122 directly to offer to discuss this further. Whether they wanted to discuss it publicly or privately doesn't really matter to me. But I want to talk about this a little bit more, because I really want to see them be the safest version of that church that they could be. And I'm going to invite them to take the Safe Church Pledge, because if a church of that size took the Safe Church Pledge, not only would it be a great example for other churches across the country and the world, but it would eliminate a lot of these concerns and make a lot of these questions easy to answer. Okay. Why else am I going to reach out to them? Why am I going to keep pressing on this? Because while secrets and things hidden in the dark tend to bring pain. Okay. What are some of those things hidden in the dark that tend to bring pain? NDAs in many cases is a good example. The truth brings freedom and peace. And that's what I want. So when I ask these critical questions of pastors, churches, just like I'm doing with Joby and 1122 today, it gives them an opportunity to answer honestly and biblically. And when they do that, it removes my questions. It removes your questions, and it leads to respect and honor. And at times, if they can't or they choose not to discuss concerns, again, that tells us a whole lot too. So I got these serious concerns. I'm going to share them with you today, but my hope is that this starts a larger conversation with Joby and myself that leads to the Church of 1122 being above reproach and being the safest version of themselves possible. But with that said, let's go ahead. Let's get into it today. All right, so let's start by looking at clip by clip. I just want to break this down into all the relevant clips, this whole section of Ruslan asking Joby about NDAs. I'm going to start and I'm going to stop. I'm going to interject here. There's a lot here. There's a lot of things that are under the surface here. So some of these clips, we may even watch parts twice, okay? But the reason why I'm stopping it so much is I'm wanting to help you see some of the questions that I have, some of the things that are under the surface. I'm wanting to challenge things pretty deeply. So let's go ahead. Let's look at this. There's going to be some good that we're going to celebrate that Joby said, some places where I'm going to give him props. And then there's going to be some places where you may have questions, and I'm going to try to answer those. There may be places where I have a question. You're like, Jeff, where did that come from? I thought that sounded really good. And hopefully I'm going to help you see why I'm asking the question that I'm asking, why I'm bringing the concern that I'm bringing. But let's go ahead and get started with clip number one.
In churches.
Okay.
I've heard the best of both worlds. I've heard the arguments all around.
Okay.
And I have friends that say, hey, we don't have NDAs, but we have what we would call non-disparagement agreements for people that take what I call severance.
Yep.
from a church. I've heard other people say, hey, man, if someone's had a bad experience working for your church, you shouldn't try to put a muzzle on them. You should let them go freely. And, even if they want to take a severance, they should be able to speak freely about what happened. Don't give away confidential things. And by the way, there's already defamation laws for these things. Okay. So I've kind of heard the best of both worlds. Utility for if someone gets fired and they're heated and they're in the heat of the moment, hey, let's let you cool down and you don't say something that you're going to regret about your home church.
All right, my bad, guys. I just saw that my mic was muted there, so let me hit that again just to let you know that first segment with Ruslan. Why is he giving all that information? Why is he talking about, hey, this is the reasons I've heard that are good for NDA use? And why is he saying these are the reasons I've heard that are probably bad for NDA use? Why is he doing all that? Why is he setting it up this way? Why is he spending this much time? Well, it's because this is a very nuanced and complex issue. At the end of the day, that's what it is. You can't just really easily say, well, all NDAs are bad and not give evidence for it. All NDAs are good, not give evidence for it. The truth is, there's just a lot of gray, a lot of tension in between. So Ruslan's trying to bring this in and say, hey, I've talked to people like Jeff and Mike Winger in depth about the reasons why we wouldn't want to use NDAs, and they've got good arguments. And I've talked to a lot of pastors about the reasons why they use NDAs and other proponents of church NDAs, and they've got a lot of good arguments and reasoning. So this is, he's essentially bringing this in, trying to be careful, saying this is tough. I know this is tough. I know this is complex. I want to let you know all the places that I see, but I want us to get into the nitty gritty of this. Now, also, I think he's trying to be really careful to start this conversation as soft as possible. But so it doesn't feel like he's coming against Joby, because again, a lot of pastors are not going to answer these questions because they're so they're so uncomfortable to do that, right? So I'll give Joby props. He's answering these questions. Ruslan props. He's doing a great job of trying to not just make this overly simplified, but he's saying, hey, this is a nuanced, complex issue. Let's talk about it in a nuanced, complex way. As he continues, though, what he's going to do is he's going to try to finish setting the stage, and you're going to hear Joby start to answer him before he's finished. I think that's important. So pay attention to where Joby starts to answer and how he starts to answer before Ruslan is done here.
Probably going to say that. Right? I could see a utility for if someone gets fired and they're heated and they're in the heat of the moment, hey, let's let you cool down and you don't say something that you're going to regret about your home church that you're probably going to say.
Right? I think the severance part has a lot to do with it.
For if someone...
Okay. So he said, all right, I can see the utility in protecting confidential information, but I've got these other concerns. He's still setting this up, and Joby jumps in before he's done, and Joby says, I think severance has a lot to do with it. Okay. This doesn't mean that Joby's bad. We all at times are going to, talk to someone and start answering a question before it's finished. But Ruslan's trying to be very careful with the nuance of this question. And Joby jumps right in to what I believe is the heart of the matter anytime we talk about severance. So I appreciate Joby bringing this up. I don't know if he meant to frame this and couch this as the heart of the matter, but this is where he interrupts Ruslan, doesn't finish letting him talk, and says, hey, this is the heart of the matter. he's going to keep coming back to this. I think it comes down to severance. Okay. So let's hear why he thinks it comes down to severance. Because I agree that it does come down to severance. Joby and I are probably going to disagree on why it comes down to severance, though, and whether severance should be used or not.
Home church that you're probably going to stay at, right?
I think the severance part has a lot to do with it, because you don't, if somebody, if it's a fireable offense, you do not owe people severance.
Okay.
But I do not think it's a good idea to pay people to go trash the bride of Christ.
Okay.
Yep. So no problem. Don't take the severance. Say whatever you want.
Okay. So he said some important things there. I think it all comes down to severance. And then the very first piece of evidence he gave for it coming down to severance, is he says, we don't actually legally have to pay people severance if we fire them. Okay. And Ruslan seemed a little bit surprised by that. Oh, okay. Right. Because the reality is you don't have to legally pay anybody severance. Even if you fire them, if you don't fire them, it doesn't matter. We don't have a legal responsibility in most parts of this country, if not all parts of this country, to pay people severance unless it's in their contract or unless it's in the organization's policies. So it's easy for pastors to say that. And I've heard this a lot over the years, and it's true, but we're going to come back to this a couple of different times in this discussion. And I'm not saying this as, again, trying to throw shade at Joby, but this is what I call true lies. And when I'm talking about true lies, it doesn't mean that a person is necessarily even trying to lie. Okay. But true lies are lies that they're things that are technically true, but they're deceiving. They're technically true, but they're not completely true the way that people are thinking. Okay. So this is what I would consider a true lie. Hey, we don't have to give people severance. That is true. Right. But what's the reason why you're saying it? This is where the deception can kind of come in a true lie, even when people aren't meaning it. Yes, it's true that you don't have to give severance. And I've heard that from a lot of pastors, but that doesn't have any bearing on whether you give severance or not. You don't have to give severance. You could choose to pay for unemployment insurance as a church. Okay. Most other businesses, they don't have a choice. They have to pay for unemployment insurance. So a lot of people don't get severances because they're going to draw unemployment, or their organization may choose to give them severances anyway, which I think is good. I think is generous. Churches don't have to pay unemployment and they don't have to pay that insurance. Okay. But if a church doesn't want to do severances, they don't have to. That's the reality. They don't have to. That part is true. Okay. But a lot of pastors will use this as, hey, we're just trying to be generous. And you're going to hear Joby talk about their generosity a little later. We're just trying to be generous, and we're doing something we don't have to do to be generous. But again, Joby said this all comes down to severance. And it's not coming down to severance just because of generosity. We know that from the next thing that he says. Okay. He says, one, we don't have to give them severance. But two, he says, I just don't think it's a good idea. I don't think we should be paying people to bash the bride of Christ. Okay. Now, I think a lot of pastors are probably going to argue, Jeff, what he's saying is we don't want to be paying someone, them still be on our payroll, and them start talking crap about the bride of Christ. What they mean is start talking crap about our church, start saying things that hurt our church. Okay. Because you can talk individually about issues you have with the church without trashing the bride of Christ. But that's not a conversation we're going to get deeply into today. But I will note, Joby talks about this, he talks about that through that language. If it's trashing the bride of Christ, it's possible for people to talk about bad experiences they've had in the church, share conversations, and it not be trashing the bride of Christ. But a lot of pastors are going to say, Jeff, we just don't want to still have them on our payroll and do that. Okay. And I would understand that. I would also say there's a good answer to that. Most severances are going to last 6 to 8 weeks. So put a time limit on the NDA, because something we've talked about a lot before, we've heard from attorneys talk about this. A good NDA is going to have a time limit on it. Okay. So a good NDA from a church there might say, hey, we don't want you to bash us while we're still paying you. So until your severance is out, you've got a non-disparagement clause. You can't say anything that's going to hurt our reputation until your severance is out. And you could say, it's not because we don't want you to say things that are true. We want you to be able to calm down, right? That's something that Ruslan's going to bring up a couple of times as well. You don't want people just blasting off on social media because they're angry, okay? So a time limit of 6 to 8 weeks would say, hey, just don't say anything that's going to be hurtful or harmful for 6 to 8 weeks. Take your payment, think it through, pray it through, and then whatever you want to say afterwards, whatever you feel led to say it. That would maybe be a good argument, but the pastors who give that argument, and pastors who give that argument like Joby, that's usually not what they mean. Because usually when they say, and this is just from my experience seeing a whole lot of NDAs, usually when they say, I don't think it's a good idea to pay somebody to bash the bride of Christ, when you look at that NDA, it is a lifetime restriction. We're going to pay you for 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 2 weeks. Maybe sometimes we're going to be hyper generous and pay you 6 to 12 months. But for that payment of somewhere between 2 weeks and a year, you for the rest of your life have a muzzle on you and can't even say things that are true, can't share any concerns, can't share anything that might disparage us, which means might make us look bad. Okay, so it is a lifelong silencing of the truth. It is a muzzle that stays on for life. So under that circumstance, the argument just doesn't hold up. We don't think it's a good idea to pay people to bash the bride of Christ. So anytime a pastor wants to use that argument, or a church HR leader or attorney wants to use that argument, I'm going to come back every single time and say, okay, if that's what you're after, why is there not a time limit on the severance agreements? And maybe Joby and 1122 have a time limit on their severance agreements, but he doesn't talk about it. Because he doesn't talk about it, it sounds, all the evidence sounds like it's leaning toward no, but I can't say that they don't for sure until we've looked at it. But that would be my recommendation. If this is what you believe, then go ahead and put a time limit on it. But honestly, he's going to keep coming back to the idea of a severance, and that is important. Because a lot of churches and pastors over the years have wanted to say it's not about the severance. The severance is just to be generous. The non-disparagement clauses and the confidentiality clauses, those are just to protect unity in the church. But again, keep coming back. Joby's leading one of the largest churches in the United States. Joby's around a lot of other pastors who are leading these churches. They share a lot of information. And Joby's going to keep coming back to, it's the severance. And he's going to say, you're going to hear him say multiple times, if you want to talk crap, if you want to say something, just don't take the money and say whatever you want. But if you take the money, you need to keep your mouth shut, right? And that's kind of my paraphrase. When you're making it about that, then it becomes very clear to me it's not about unity. The non-disclosure part and the non-disparagement part is not about unity. It's not about protecting people. It's an exchange of money to keep you quiet. And as he keeps talking about this, I want you to keep asking, what is the consideration in this contract? Because if a contract doesn't have consideration, it's not a valid contract. And consideration simply means I'm giving you something in consideration to get something else back. I'm giving you something I wouldn't normally give. I'm doing something I wouldn't normally do so that you will do something for me that you wouldn't normally do and give something that you wouldn't normally give. And it sounds to me like the consideration in these severances that he is talking about as a pastor is we're giving you money so that you will stay quiet, not say anything that hurts the reputation of the church. Okay. And if you don't want to take that money, say whatever you want. But if you want to take that money, you don't need to say those things. That's what I'm hearing. So you tell me if I'm wrong, you listen in, let me know in the comments, let me know in the chat. But every time I listen to this, I just hear it clear as day. And I'm like, I appreciate how honest Joby's being, because it sounds like he's being very honest. This is a contract and an exchange of money for you being silent. And that is way more honest than a lot of churches are going to be.
Utility for if
your spot. A church tries to obey the law of the land, fill out all the forms, be in alignment with the government institutions that you have to be in, try to do things legally correct, and then you take advice from the lawyers, and then everybody slams you for doing that. So it's like either way you're going to lose.
Yeah. I've pointed that out before. I've said, hey, man, a lot of this stuff is HR and lawyers trying to do their best.
100%, man.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an argument that I hear a lot. It's an argument that sounds good. This is something that Ruslan and I have talked about offline because he's heard it from multiple pastors. But I want us to break that down. What did Joby say there? Joby said, man, it's kind of a danged if you do, danged if you don't situation here. Like, we're trying to follow the laws of the land as a church. We're trying to follow the laws. We're trying to fill out all the forms. We're trying to do the things that the government says we need to do. And because we're doing that, we're listening to HR people and we're listening to lawyers. And man, we're just trying to do what they're telling us to do. And then people are on our tails about it. And then if we weren't doing that, people would be on our tails for not doing that. That's essentially what he said. Okay, so let's think about that in reality, though. He says, we're trying to follow the laws of the land. Let's just go ahead. Let's start with laws of the land. We're trying to follow the laws of the land. Some of you may be aware of this. Some of you may not be aware of this, but let me go ahead. Well, I'm not going to be able to pull it up here. Maybe I can show it after in post. But if you look up the NLRB ruling, the National Labor Review Board ruling, McLaren versus McComb, you're actually going to see that the board ruled in February of 2023. February of 2023, they actually ruled that it was illegal for churches, or not for churches. They ruled that it was illegal for businesses and corporations to use overly broad non-disparagement clauses and overly broad confidentiality clauses. And why did they rule that that was illegal? They ruled it was illegal because it actually took away workers' rights under the National Labor Relations Act that Congress put into place decades ago. Okay. Now, there's some rumblings. There are people who say, because we have a conservative president and now who's very pro-business, that the NLRB may roll those back because that's law set by an agency, and law set by a government agency, it can move back and forth. But for it to move back and forth, they've got to actually hear somebody making a challenge to them where they can rule in a different way. But right now, the law of the land is that using overly broad non-disparagement provisions and confidentiality provisions in a severance that would likely silence an employee, that is illegal. That's against the law of the land today. And it's been against the law of the land going back to 2023. And although it wasn't against the law of the land for a few years, if you go back long term, it's been against the law of the land. That is how the NLRB has interpreted those provisions more often than not in recent decades. Okay. So when Joby says, man, it's a catch-22, we're trying to follow the law of the land. And I hear this from pastors. I hear this from people all the time. My number one objection is, if you're trying to follow the law of the land, you would be following McLaren versus McComb, and you wouldn't be using overly broad non-disparagement clauses. You wouldn't be using confidentiality clauses. And if you're not using those, the only other reason for an NDA is to protect actual confidential information of parishioners or trade secrets. But that's not what Joby's talking about. Joby's going to come back again and again and again and say, if you want to talk, just don't take the money. Okay. So if you're giving money for someone not to talk, you're giving money for someone to toe the company line and say good things and bring, quote unquote, unity to the church. If that's what you're doing, then it's likely having broad non-disparagement provisions in it and overly broad confidentiality provisions in it, because if it doesn't, it's not going to actually keep somebody quiet. So he says, man, we're darned if we do, darned if we don't. We're just trying to follow the laws of the land. And respectfully, Joby, I would just challenge you and say those kind of severance agreements that could potentially silence someone like that, they're generally against the law of the land. Okay. Now, when I was given one to sign, or my wife was given one to sign, one of the first people that we heard from was an HR leader at a church who said, hey, this is against the law. Churches can get by with it because of separation of church and state. Churches can get away with it because of the ecclesiastical abstention. Courts just don't want to touch it. Okay. So it's not going to do, it's not going to be illegal for churches, but it would be illegal for anybody else. That's what they're doing to you. Okay. Lawyers, if you look, HR professionals, lawyers, look back February 2023, when this first came out, they have given tons and tons of guidance on this. And they would tell businesses, they would tell organizations, they would tell standard nonprofits, you can't use overly broad non-disparagement provisions anymore. You can't use overly broad confidentiality clauses anymore. You can't do anything that's going to make it look like you're giving somebody money to tell them what they can and can't say about their work experience. That infringes upon their rights. So we got to be careful how we draft these. And because of that, a lot less companies have been using NDAs in the same way because of that. Now, so there's just a lot there. So what, again, lovingly, respectfully, I would just tell Joby, I appreciate that sentiment and that sounds good, but it's not reality. It's not true. Because if you're trying to obey the laws of the land, you're going to say we need to stay away from even the appearance of broad non-disparagement provisions, broad confidentiality provisions. We need to stay away from even the appearance of we might be giving somebody money so that in exchange consideration, they might be quiet about what we're saying. So if this was a business leader on a podcast like this, I would be saying, hey, somebody needs to investigate this. Somebody needs to potentially sue over this because it sounds like they're breaking the law of the land. And I know that that's not the law of the land necessarily for churches. It's not going to be enforced with churches, but that is basically the excuse that Joby is given while he's saying we're trying to follow the law of the land. He also says you got to fill out all the forms. We try to fill out all the forms. Yet one of the things we talk about all the time is that churches are the only nonprofits. Churches and ministries are the only nonprofits that don't have to fill out a Form 990. So if we're trying to follow the laws of the land and we're trying to fill out all the forms, then I think in that case, you would say, well, even if we're not required to fill out the form because we're a church, we're going to try to fill out all the forms and follow all the laws and act as above reproach as they would ask a secular institution or a secular business to do. So we'll just fill out that 990, or we'll give out enough information so it looks like that 990. Now, I'm not with Joby there. I don't actually think churches should fill out 990s. I think churches should be given their own transparency, and it should be in a lot of ways more transparent than what a 990 is. But I don't think the government should be telling them to do that. But this is a common excuse. We're just trying to do what the law says. We're trying to follow the law. We're trying to not get sued. Any attorney worth their salt, any HR rep worth their salt would tell any organization outside of a church, you can't do this. You got to change some of these things. You got to be careful with this stuff, because if you don't, it's going to go against the law of the land. The reality is a lot of churches, and he's going to blame this on the lawyers and the HR, right? That's what he's doing. A lot of churches, they say, well, it's just the lawyers and the HR folks. They gave us these templates and they gave us these documents. We didn't know what they meant. We didn't know what they meant. We didn't know what that non-disparagement provision was. Well, there's a couple of things that are going on there. One, lawyers and HR reps are only going to do that when they understand. Generally, they're only going to do that when they understand that the church is exempt from that law, that the church can get by with some of this stuff. And then they may say, well, I'm going to try to protect my client as much as I can, and I'm going to use a tool that we can't use with secular businesses, secular organizations, because we're going to try to protect them. Okay. So in that case, you could have an attorney telling them that. Now, any good attorney and any good HR person would say, well, this would actually be against the law for a regular organization, but because you're a church, you could do it. Okay. That would be what a good attorney or a good HR rep would say. And then a pastor, a church staff member has to be able to say, well, you know what? I'm not a legal expert. I'm not an HR expert, but if we can only do something because of separation of church and state, we can only do something because of ecclesiastical abstention. If the only reason we can do it is because we're a church and it's illegal for everybody else to do because it looks bad and infringes on people's rights, then we don't want to do that. We want to be more above reproach than the world. We don't want to be less above reproach than the world. That would be where a pastor has to be able to ask questions and just say, that doesn't sound like the moral high ground to me. And that's where Ruslan's friend and another friend of mine, Pastor Daniel Golding, we talked about it. He ended up sitting down with lawyers because he didn't understand a lot of this stuff till we talked about it. He ended up sitting down with his lawyers and he said, I understand that the non-disparagement provision protects us, but I need you to look at it through the lens of a pastor, through the lens of a church, not wanting to make it even have the appearance that we might be trying to silence someone or keep them from telling the truth. And when the lawyer looked at it that way, they said, we got to get rid of this non-disparagement clause, right? That's the role of a pastor. You don't have to be a legal expert to say, help me understand what this is. Okay, that doesn't sound like it's something that we should do. Okay, so I just think it's much more rare that an attorney or an HR rep is throwing something like that into an agreement and you didn't know completely and they didn't give you enough information to even ask those questions. And I would encourage you, if that's the case and they just threw it in there and you didn't know enough to ask those questions, and then it comes out and there's a firestorm because it looks like you're silencing people for hush money, well, that lawyer, that HR rep could be sued. That lawyer could be sued for malpractice because they didn't give you good advice and it led you to getting in trouble if they didn't give you all of the information there. Okay. So again, it sounds like a good excuse. We're just trying to do what the HR reps and what the lawyers are telling us to do. We're trying to follow the law of the land. And I appreciate that heart, but I have to challenge it, Joby, because it's actually against the law of the land in most cases. And any good attorney, any good HR rep is going to tell you, hey, you got to be careful with this. So it just, again, it doesn't hold water and it doesn't make sense. This is a common excuse. So I'm not just throwing shade at Joby. He's probably heard this from other people over the years because this is one of the most common excuses that I hear from pastors. It's just not a good excuse.
weird spot. A church.
Interesting. I'm curious, like if someone has a bad experience at a church, how do you feel about them sharing about that experience, as long as it's not defaming and exaggerated?
Well, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, all the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people, I believe in the freedom of speech. And so I don't.
So let's just stop right there for just a second. Ruslan says, hey, as long as it's not defamation, you're not saying false things, which we, just hurt somebody, which we've already got laws against. How do you feel about people sharing their experience at a church if they've had a bad experience? And I want you to think about how Joby's answering this, because this is careful. There's some good things here, but this is careful. And it just feels like a lot of non-answers to me. Okay. His first answer is not answering the question, how do you feel about it? His first question is, it happens all the time. Okay. Whether it happens all the time, that's not even really quantifiable, because we know he's not being literal. It happens all the time, every single time they do that, right? So because he's not being literal, what does it happens all the time mean? Does that mean it happens the majority of the time? That it happens a lot? That it happens sometimes, right? So it's very vague. But he says it happens all the time. But he didn't answer the question. Listen to the rest of his answers, and you just see, is he directly answering the question, how do you feel about agreements and provisions that would keep people from telling the truth about their experience? How do you feel about people telling the truth about their experience when it's not defaming and it's true?
I would question the character of the person that is taking money from the church that they are disparaging.
Okay. So the first thing we got is kind of that deflection. Well, it happens all the time. The second thing he says is, I believe in freedom of speech, which is the closest thing to an answer we've got, because you could extrapolate and assume, okay, well, if he believes in freedom of speech, he believes in people being able to tell the truth about their experiences and not be censored. But he's not very clear about that. So it's just, hey, it happens all the time. I believe in freedom of speech, but I would really question the character of anybody who takes that money from their church, who takes severance money and then dogs the church. Okay. So again, you got kind of a non-answer. You got another kind of half answer. I believe in freedom of speech, but he comes back to the severance. I would question the character of someone who takes that money and talks bad about the church. Okay. Well, again, it's about the money. If you're taking the money, then you can't talk. And if you don't take the money, then you can talk, which is a silencing NDA. A silencing NDA is anytime that we're exchanging money or other consideration to keep you from being able to tell the truth about your experiences. Okay. We're not saying you can't say false things just to hurt people. Okay. But we're literally saying you can't tell the truth about your experiences. But not only does he say that, and he brings it back to the money and the severance, but I want you to think about what he said, because I think this is important. And Joby, I don't know if you meant to do this or not, but again, I'm trying to be as good faith here as possible, but I just got to challenge you on that. You didn't give much of an answer. You said you believe in freedom of speech, but it's kind of like, yeah, I believe in freedom of speech, but I would really question the character of anybody who does that. You immediately villainize someone who would use their right of free speech. You immediately villainize someone who would say something that you would perceive bad about the church. Like, you're questioning their character. They got character problems for potentially telling the truth. And the only reason why they got character problems for telling the truth about their experience or telling the truth about their concerns, the only thing that makes it a character problem is because they took money from you and signed a contract. Like, it just doesn't sound good, man. It sounds a little dirty. It sounds a little sleazy. It's not good optics. And that's something Ruslan's going to come back with a couple of different times is, hey, NDAs, just I get some of the reasoning for them. I hear what people are saying, but they're just not good optics. I don't think it's good optics for a pastor to basically just say, hey, we're villainizing anybody who did this. And again, why would you question their character? Not because they're lying, not because they're causing division, not because of any of that. He's questioning their character because they took severance money and then they talked. He's essentially questioning their character because they broke a contract. Why would it be a broken contract? Well, most likely it would be a broken contract because it includes broad confidentiality provisions and broad non-disparagement provisions. So again, there's more in what he's saying than you would think, but there's also a lot in what he's not saying.
Well, no problem. If they don't want to enter into that agreement with the church, no problem. Say whatever you want to say. I mean, I am sure you could find a number of people around here that would have horrible things to say about 1122.
Yeah.
And it hurts my heart. And I hate it for them. I hate it for us. I hate all of those things. For
Okay. So again, he says some more important stuff there. Joby says, hey, very clearly, I've kind of paraphrased it a couple of times, but you heard it straight from his mouth there. Hey, if you don't want to take the money, that's fine. Say whatever you want. But if you're going to take the money, you essentially need to be quiet about it, right? Again, his concern from the first answer on keeps coming back to this severance money. And if you take the severance money, you need to be quiet. And if you don't want to be quiet and you want to tell the truth about your experience, don't take the severance money. Now, think about what that means, though. And again, Joby, maybe you're not dialed into the business side enough to know this, okay? But this is what I would challenge with. And this is the kind of stuff that somebody like Ruslan generally wouldn't know how to ask because he's not been on this side of it a ton, okay? But when you say that, when you say, man, I would question the character of someone who talked and said true things about their experience if they took the money. He says, if you want to talk, just don't take the money. What he's essentially saying is, hey, if you want to talk, you're not getting any unemployment. You're not getting any severance. You may not have a clue how you're going to feed your family or pay rent or pay your mortgage. So why don't you take all of that risk? And that's the risk that you would take to tell the truth about your experience. That's the risk that you would take to be able to share your concerns. Because it sounds good. Just don't take the money if you want to tell the truth. But in reality, what he's saying is, hey, if you want to tell the truth, no unemployment, no severance, you're out on your ear. Let's see if you can pay your bills and take care of your family. That is terrifying. That doesn't sound like shepherding. That doesn't sound Christ-like. That doesn't sound loving. And it's the reason why, guys, I hear this all the time. It's the reason why so many people sign NDAs. They sign NDAs from churches and know they don't want to sign the NDA. They know they don't want to be silenced, but they're literally facing the reality of, if I don't get this severance, I can't pay rent in 5 days. I can't put groceries on the table. My kids are going to starve. I may lose my house. I don't know what I'm going to do. And out of that fear, they sign. But that little bit of money helps get them through for a month or two, sometimes up to 6 months. But then years later, they still got concerns because they're watching the same people, and they're watching new people at that church get hurt in the same ways over and over and over again. And nobody's saying anything because they're signing NDAs. I don't know if that's what's happening at 1122 or not. I hope it's not. But it's not okay for a pastor to say that without giving all those caveats. Pastors don't normally talk about the fact that when somebody gets fired, if they don't have a severance, they have nothing. So that severance is hung over their head like this massive carrot, this massive millstone. If you don't take this severance, this millstone is going to fall on your head, right? It is so much more manipulative than the regular person would realize. And again, maybe Joby's not involved in a ton of that business stuff and he's not even thinking about it. But as a pastor, that's where he's got to step in and go, it's not what the attorneys are saying. It's not what HR is saying. It's not about what we can get away with. It's about what is right to take care of this person, to take care of this family well.
420 employees here. We have a full HR department. And the overwhelming majority of what Alex Gonzalez does is she spends the majority of her time.
I believe Alex Gonzalez is their kind of lead HR person. So he's saying the majority of what our HR leader does.
I'm trying to help people have the best employment experience that they can have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, man, I've been sued for things and she has to get involved with lawyers and, none.
Let's stop there because that is very important. He's talking about Alex Gonzalez, the HR lead is what it sounds like. And he says, hey, their number one job as our HR leader is to make sure people are having a good employment experience. But I've been sued. I've been sued many times. And then she has to get involved. That's where I hit a big pause because it gives me lots of questions. Okay. I'm assuming what Joby means to say, kind of reading through the tea leaves here, is when he says, I've been sued multiple times, many times, however he said it, and she had to get involved. I'm assuming he means to say the church has been sued. I've been named as a defendant with the church, and then she has to get involved because the church is being sued. Because if he's getting sued personally, the church's HR leader should not be getting involved in those lawsuits. Okay? If I work at a business, my HR leader is not going to be getting involved in my lawsuits. if I'm running a company and I'm getting sued personally, my HR leader is not going to be getting involved in my lawsuits. But that's what he said. But I've been sued a lot of times. And then this HR leader's got to get involved in these lawsuits. But now let's hear what else he says about those lawsuits. So that's a little bit of a concern. But again, it's not a concern if it's talking about 1122. So I'm just going to assume that's what he's talking about. 1122 has been sued. And if he's been named, it says the leader of 1122, and she's getting involved. So what happens in these lawsuits once HR gets involved?
None of those lawsuits have ever come to fruition because it was just people saying things that weren't true. So what should we do in those situations? I mean, you know, when Jesus sends out the 12 the first time, he's like, I need you to be as innocent as a dove and as shrewd as a serpent. And so I think that's true for us too as a church.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says, I get sued. She gets involved. But the thing is, none of those lawsuits have ever come to fruition because they were just frivolous. People just making stuff up. Again, just like I would question the character. He said, I would question the character of anybody who takes that money and says something. Well, now I've had a bunch of these lawsuits, but they've all been frivolous. They've all been people making things up. They've all been false. It again feels like villainization, but I want us just to think about this. I want us to think about what he's saying, what he's not saying, because it's very important. When he says none of these lawsuits came to fruition, what does that mean? And Joby, all I can do is guess. All I can do is fill in the gaps with the data that makes the most sense. I'm making some assumptions here, though. So I'm not making an argument. I'm making educated assumptions. And I invite you to show me where I'm wrong, okay? Because if I'm wrong, I want the right data so I can correct it and actually, kind of close this loop. But all I can do is make educated assumptions at this point because I don't have all the information. When he says none of these lawsuits came to fruition, if a person has a bunch of lawsuits against them or a company has a bunch of lawsuits against them, it is statistically highly unlikely that with multiple lawsuits, all of them are going to be false and have no merit. Zero merit. That's how he's making it sound. They're just false. They're made up. There's zero merit. That is statistically highly unlikely. Actually, if you're having repeated lawsuits, the statistical likelihood is there's something going on there. Maybe none of them are 100% true, but they're probably not 100% false. It's the old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. Okay? There's a bunch of different lawsuits. There's probably some fire somewhere, even if it's not the fire people are saying it is. That's where we got to look inward and we got to say, what's going on here? How can we treat people in a different way that avoids these lawsuits? But again, he says none of these lawsuits came to fruition. He said the reason why was because they were false. But none of these lawsuits came to fruition doesn't mean that they won a jury trial on them. It doesn't. And likely, they didn't take all these lawsuits to jury trial. Likely, the most likely thing that's going to happen with any organization, but especially a church, is an out-of-court settlement. Let's pay you. Sometimes we keep from getting the insurance involved just to pay you to go away. Sometimes the insurance gets involved and they want us to pay a settlement because court's expensive. And even if we're innocent, okay, again, given the benefit of the doubt, even if we're innocent, a jury trial is expensive and a jury, juries aren't predictable. You don't know how they're going to react. So we could be innocent, still get a verdict that goes against us, and then it hurts our reputation. Hurts our reputation a lot more to be in court, this play out in the public, than to settle it publicly. So the most likely scenario, the most likely explanation is that when he said these cases have never come to fruition, the most likely explanation is they didn't come to fruition because they were settled out of court, which means money was paid. Probably another confidentiality clause was in there. And again, in court, you can get those in those settlements very easy because it's, hey, if we're going to give you this money, we want this to go away. So you can't just be talking about us in the court of public opinion because then it hasn't really went away. Okay. But again, we wouldn't know. We likely wouldn't know because a lot of times people can't talk about those settlements. So, and again, that doesn't mean that they're guilty. But what it would mean is in that scenario, instead of saying, hey, we get sued all the time, but none of them come to fruition because they're false, it would be saying, if that's the case, it would be saying more truthfully, hey, we gotten sued a lot, but we just settled all of them out of court. So we can't prove whether we were guilty or not, which to me, I would begin asking the question, is that a good use of tithe money to continue to settle out of court? Okay. But again, that may not be it. That's just the most likely explanation based on how the court system works. Okay. It could also be that every single lawsuit that's ever been brought against 1122 was frivolous, was fabricated, was made up, and it was dismissed on merits before it got to discovery. It was dismissed on merits before it advanced to jury trial. It was dismissed on merits before a settlement could happen. And in that case, that would be a judge going, hey, there's nothing here. This is all completely false and made up, and there's no evidence. That could have happened, but it is highly unlikely, statistically highly unlikely, that many people are bringing just made up suits against the church. And if that was the case, usually if that's the case, a pastor is going to say it that way. Hey, man, we've had a lot of court cases brought against us. We've been sued a bunch. Man, none of them made it past the first hearing because, man, they didn't have any evidence and the judge threw them out. That's not what he said. He said they never come to fruition. And coming to fruition means, I think most people would take this to mean getting it to the end of a jury trial where you have a verdict. Somebody wins, somebody loses, and somebody is having to pay for damages. So again, I think there's so much, there's more said in what he didn't say there than what he did say. This is why it's important talking about pastors like Robert Morris and churches like Gateway. It's why it's important that we have to understand the difference between a dismissed lawsuit and a won lawsuit or a lost lawsuit.
Quote unquote silencing NDAs, where someone is told that they can't ever speak on anything, even if they didn't take, like I'm hearing of like front loaded NDAs to even work at a church.
I think there is some information,
confidential information.
Yeah.
I think
people's
that's fair.
giving records and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think it would apply to those people, but in general, on the front end, somebody would have to explain to me why you would want to do that on the front end.
No.
Okay. So he's asked about front-loaded NDAs. I like a ton of Joby's answer there. There's a lot of good stuff there. Ruslan's basically saying, hey, I'm hearing that some people are having to sign an NDA just to be able to work at a church before they even start. And I have seen that. I've shared that with Ruslan. And I appreciate Joby says, man, I don't really get that. I'm not sure why you would do that. I agree with him. There are some things that need to be that need to be held confidential. People's giving information, their addresses, ministerial counseling sessions, those kind of things all need to be kept confidential. Those are good uses of NDA. So I agree with that. I appreciate that he said you'd really have to show your work to me on why you would want to use one at the beginning. I think that would be a really good place for pastors to start. Actually, I would encourage Joby. I think that would be a good place for him to start on all these. You're going to have to really show your work to me on why we should use an NDA here. Whatever here is. When an HR person or a lawyer says, hey, you should use an NDA, okay, show me your work, explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, help me understand why we would do this. Okay, now with that being said, let me give you a case, Joby, on why you should use. This is going to freak some people out. This is not what people are expecting. I want to give you a case on why you should use an NDA as a church on the front end. I believe if a church is going to use an NDA, it should only be used to protect parishioner information, like giving records, addresses, counseling information. NDA should only protect parishioners, not the reputation of the church or anything like that, okay? And if that's the case, when should you sign that agreement? A lot of pastors and a lot of churches will say, well, no, we got to use these agreements because we've got to protect parishioner information. And then when they're pressed on what else is in that agreement, or you see what else is in that agreement, you realize it has nothing to do with protecting confidential information, or maybe it has just a little bit to do with it. But one of the things I press pastors with when they say that is, hey, we got to protect confidential information. They're fired or they're leaving, and we got to have them sign this so they don't take people's giving records and release them, or they don't release their addresses and phone numbers and stuff like that. I would actually challenge them, if you care about privacy and you're trying to protect confidential information of congregants, nobody should work there and see or hear that confidential information without first agreeing before they ever hear it, before they ever see it. I'm going to handle this well. I'm agreeing legally that I will not do anything with this information improperly. I'm not going to do anything to hurt anybody. And if I do, you can take the full recompense of the law because I'm doing damage to someone. Okay. If you don't care about it until they're leaving, you didn't care about it. Because anytime you want somebody to sign a confidential agreement when you're talking about proprietary information and stuff like that, it is almost always done on the front end. I'm not going to share with you the proprietary information if I don't have a confidentiality agreement already set in place. Does that make sense? So that's the reason that I would give, Joby. I would actually say if you're going to use NDAs, the only good reason to do it is to protect parishioners. And if you're doing it to protect parishioners, it needs to be done on the front end. Now, to Ruslan's credit, that's not what I'm hearing. Most of the time when they're done on the front end, I'm seeing them done nefariously. But I'm a big believer if you're using them for the right reason, they should be done on the front end. And I don't think they should have anything to do with a severance. If you're using a good NDA for the right reasons, I just don't think it has anything to do with a severance, because it should be done so far away from a severance that that's not what anybody is thinking about.
Versus like a disgruntled employee that's going to want a severance and then also go blast you all over the place. Because the reality is that even if you try to defend those things, it typically just gets worse, man.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because oftentimes the person wants to fight like that, especially online, man. My daddy used to always say, it's like fighting a pig. Everybody gets dirty and the pig likes it.
Yeah.
And so that's what they want.
Information.
Okay, so again, there's a lot there. He says, hey, does that make sense? It's different protecting confidential information versus a disgruntled employee who wants to kind of burn the whole thing down or just, hurt people, right? And again, I would just come back to, Joby, I don't know if you're doing it on purpose, but I would encourage you to really look at it. Every single time you've talked about someone speaking out or telling the truth after they've left the church, every single time that you've done that, you have villainized them. You've called them disgruntled. You've used other words, other phrases for it, but this time it was disgruntled. Every single time, though, you're villainizing them. I would question their character if they did this. It doesn't seem like you're even allowing for the possibility that a person with good character who's not disgruntled could have a valid concern that they wanted to share, or a valid concern about their experience and tell anybody else. And I think that's the reason why it makes sense that you could justify using a severance to keep people quiet. Because if you see anybody who says anything who takes that severance as bad, then you just give them the severance because you're trying to protect against the bad people. But I also wonder, he hasn't talked, he said a couple of times, if you don't want to take the severance money, say whatever you want to say, that's fine. And I think the reason why he's saying that is because he likely knows, okay, he at least should know in his position. And again, maybe he doesn't, but I think it's safe to say that he should know that people are counting on that. And without that, they don't have any other safety net to fall into, right? So I haven't heard him say anything bad so far about the people who don't take the money and tell the truth, but I'm just betting if there's somebody who didn't take the money and is saying things that he feels like is making his church look bad, that based on the way he's talking about the others, my guess is he's probably going to villainize them as well. But he kind of keeps on with the villainizing role. He says, even if you can't answer it, it's not going to work out. It's not going to be good. It usually doesn't help. My dad always said, you wrestle with a pig and, you both get dirty and they like it. So again, it's more villainizing. You're wrestling with a pig, right? That's what they want. You're going to get dirty and they're going to like it. But he's also, just as he's talking about that, he's basically saying there's no way we can be above reproach here. There's no way we can really answer, because if we answer, we're just going to get dirty with the pig. If we answer, it's just not going to work out. But the problem with that is that the Bible teaches if you want to be an elder, you got to be above reproach. And you can't be above reproach. I've said this probably 100 times on this podcast. You cannot be above reproach if you're not willing to answer reproach. Being above reproach means I was reproached, an allegation was made, a concern was brought, a correction was brought. I gave evidence to why that thing isn't true, doesn't stick. Now I've risen above it. I'm above reproach. I'm cleared of that allegation. I'm cleared of that concern. Okay. So if it's, hey, we can't really say anything anyway, essentially you're saying, well, I can't follow the Bible here because the Bible says to be above reproach, but my daddy said I'll just get dirty rolling around with a pig. So I don't want to get dirty rolling around with a pig. So I'm just going to follow dad's advice and ignore my heavenly dad's advice. I'm going to ignore biblical advice because I think the reality is if allegations are false, then all a church has to do is bring receipts and they're going to be above reproach. Okay. Now, some people will say, yeah, but if you answer that, they just got another question. Okay. Answer that one. And if you keep answering enough of them, people are going to look at it and go, oh, this person who keeps bringing these allegations is just, man, it's false. It's tired. It is what it is. We can't trust them anymore. Okay. But we can give all kinds of excuses like that and ignore that the Bible says we are supposed to be above reproach and that a sinning elder is supposed to be disciplined and rebuked in the presence of all, right? And the reason why they be rebuked and disciplined in the presence of all is because they were above reproach. They became above reproach in the presence of all. You don't want those false allegations hanging. So again, it just feels like a lot of villainizing anybody who might bring a concern, villainizing anybody who talks and brings this money, and then saying, man, we couldn't even say anything anyway. So, we just got to let it go. We're not going to deal with those people because that is wrestling with pigs. It's essentially saying we're not dealing with reproach. It's a big concern to me, Joey.
Like don't defame, disparagement. If someone had a bad experience, they want to talk about it. I'm not mad at that, but I do think, and I've heard it from folks like, Andy, you get fired, you're upset, you're angry, you want to go vent about it. One of the worst things you could do is hop online and start talking about something.
And I appreciate Ruslan here because he's saying, hey, I get it. If it's not defamation, I'm not mad about somebody. He's being very honest. I'm not upset. I'm not going to villainize somebody. I'm not mad if they're telling the truth as long as it's not defamation. That doesn't seem to be where Joby's drawing the line. I appreciate it's where Ruslan's drawing the line. Hey, don't just go out and torch people. Don't just go out and try to defame the church and its leaders and hurt them by saying false things. I don't have a problem if you're saying true things, but then Ruslan's going to come to his biggest concern. He brought this up early. He's bringing it up now. I don't think Joby ever really engages with it to the level that I would have hoped that he would, because I think Ruslan's right on with his concern. But he's talking about it. He's like, hey, when people get fired and they're upset, the last thing that you want them doing is going online and just venting all of that anger. They're probably going to say things they're going to regret. It can hurt everybody. It can hurt relationships, which, going back to it again, I've already made the recommendation. I share the recommendation that I give the pastors all the time that I would give here, but I think it would actually fix the concern that Ruslan has. And Ruslan probably has this in a lot of ways because he's heard this from so many pastors. I think the answer to that is you just put a time limit on it. That if you want to put a non-defamation, confidentiality clause, non-disparagement clause, put it on for a limited period of time. Give somebody a cool down, pay them, let them find another job, that sort of thing. Let the passion and the anger and the frustration and the fear, let that melt away a little bit. And then they're free to tell the truth. And even if they say, thinking about this in church, even if they say something that I disagree with, if it's not defamation, it's not false, even if they are still angry later, like, that's not on the church to fix. That's on that person to deal with. That's on that person to answer for. And it's just funny. We almost treat it in churches. I just think this is, it doesn't make any sense. It caused a lot of kind of distance for me. Because I was on staff at a church. My wife was on staff, and you get hired. And like, I know when we got hired, we went through all kinds of personality assessments. I had to see a psychiatrist before they hired me. After they hired me, I had to see a vocational psychiatrist again, or psychologist again, to go through, what kind of leader I was. Like, they did all these assessments, all these things. It took months to get hired. And then, I worked with them for, 5 years. My wife worked with them for years. And then all of a sudden you get handed this NDA, and all of a sudden it's like, we can't trust you. We can't trust you to have good character. We can't trust you not to lie. We can't trust you to sow division. So it's weird. It's like, hey, we can put you through all of this rigmarole, and we trust you enough to hire you and put people under your care as a pastor, but we don't trust you enough to leave and not just start telling lies. So I think if pastors and churches are this concerned about not being able to trust the people who are leaving their staff, I actually think that's a hiring problem. I think you're not doing your due diligence, or you're not doing it well enough in the hiring process. Because if you can trust them when you hire them, then you ought to be able to trust their character and morality when you fire them. Okay. Especially if you're taking care of them. Right. But again, I think if you put a time limit on it, then if they're going to say something and it's untrue, that's a problem. But if they're going to say something that's not untrue, and you think they're still too angry, that's between them and God. It's not the church's place to say, we're just going to try to protect them from sinning with this silencing contract.
While you're still upset of how something panned out. So it's a tricky thing. I've never heard of a church legally suing someone for breaching an NDA.
Me either.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where it's a lot of legal stuff to try and protect the church. Optically, I don't think it looks great. Like, if I'm going to be honest, like I was like, oh, that doesn't look good.
Okay. So Ruslan says something important there. Joby doesn't say a lot, but there's a big yeah. I kind of like I agree in the background. But Ruslan says, I've never heard of a church suing someone for breaking an NDA. And then you got Joby in the background. Yeah. And Ruslan just says, I think it's maybe a legal thing. It's for protection of the church. But the implication here is I've not heard of this. It probably doesn't happen a lot. I wonder if this is really a big deal. Okay. So I want to just speak to that for a second. One, I think it's a big deal even if nobody ever sues. Okay. If no church ever sues anybody for breaking an NDA, it's still a big deal because it's the legal threat hanging over your head. The power that a church has over someone when they sign an NDA is not the power of the court. The power they have is the threat of the court, the threat of litigation. Because for most of us, when we go to a church, the church has more money than the individual. Okay? Because the individuals are giving to the church. A church like 1122, I believe, has a $90 million budget, was what I heard. I could be wrong on that, but it's pretty big. Their budget, their assets, their income, it's been going up. They got a lot of money. They're going to have no problem paying a lawyer to keep somebody busy in court. But for you and I, for most regular people, trying to keep a lawyer up against a big organization like that can have multiple lawyers and they tie you up in discovery and they tie you up in depositions, man, that could bankrupt you. I've even heard a pastor say, and I've told you guys this before, but I've heard a pastor say before when another staff member was worried, what if this person comes back and says this? What if they say that thing to try to hurt us? He said, well, we have more money than them. We'll keep them tied up in court. We'll take everything they own, right? It's that fear is where the power's at. It's the fear that we've got a contract that says this church with all this money and all these lawyers could sue me. They could take back the severance. They could take everything that I own. They could destroy my reputation if they want. Even if they don't, there's that fear and that risk that they could. And for most church staff who don't have a lot of money, and I know this is something Ruslan and I have talked about a lot, the majority of church staff, the majority of pastors, they don't make hardly any money at all. They're vastly underpaid. And Ruslan, I would say it's because they're so underpaid and because they don't have unemployment and everything like that. Man, it is terrifying thinking that your church with all that money and those lawyers could sue you. And I say that from experience because I've lived it. I've lived it, right? It's terrifying. So that's kind of the first thing I would say is even if no church ever sues, the power is not in actually suing. The power is in the threat of litigation. And they could litigate and never actually let the suit get started and already cost somebody so much money that they're willing to drop it and just be quiet. Okay. So there's power in the threat of litigation. But the other thing that I would say is I think there's a good reason why you've never heard of churches suing over NDAs. There's actually a couple of good reasons. One, and Ruslan named this. So I think it's just a matter of connecting the dots there because his brain's already doing this work. It's not a good look for churches to have NDAs. It's an even worse look for churches to sue. Okay. And when you sue, those records become public. Most churches are never going to sue. They know when they're creating the document, we're never going to sue. It's about the threat of litigation and the power that gives you. And again, I got to be careful here. This is not legal advice because a church could sue at any moment. But if more people who sign these NDAs simply say, yeah, I'm not going to follow this, they would realize most of these churches are not going to sue. But the reason why people don't do that is because there's the threat they could sue and come after you. But if they sue, it's a terrible look because those proceedings are going to be largely public. You're going to have to go to discovery, which is a big deal because then it's like, okay, well, those concerns you're trying to keep me quiet about, let's go ahead and search for those concerns. So let's say that Gateway was suing somebody over a breached NDA to keep them quiet. Well, then they could come back and go, well, part of what I'm talking about in my concerns are these financial issues that could be illegal in some ways. So let's just do discovery for all of these financial issues, right? There's so much hidden stuff that can come to light, that can be twisted, that is now thrown out there on the internet for anybody to see because it's going to become public when it's in court. Most churches are not going to do that. So again, I think Ruslan, the reason why you don't hear about it is because it it's not good for the church in 9 out of 10 situations. Probably it's not good for the church in 99 out of 100 situations to sue. If they do that, they're going to be the losers. So again, it's the threat of suing. So when he talks about it being, I think it's just this like legal thing to protect the church. I hear that, and it sounds good when we call it a legal thing to protect the church. But again, I think this is a true lie. And nobody's really telling this true lie. It's just a true lie that we tend to believe. Because that's what Ruslan's starting to believe. I think it's just this thing to protect the church. No big deal. They're not actually going to sue. It's just to protect the church. What I would call that in reality, though, is that's a lie. It's a lie to intimidate someone into silence. That most of these churches don't ever intend on suing anyone, and they're never going to sue anyone over that, but they're lying about the potential to sue, or they're saying we do have the potential to sue, which is true, but it's a true lie because they know they're never going to sue. And why are they telling that true lie? To intimidate someone into silence. So like what Joby's doing here, Joby said some really good things. He said things that I want to believe, right? And I think most of us want to believe when we hear it from pastors. He's saying all these good things that make you want to listen to him. And if you don't know the questions to ask, then you're not pushing back. You're not challenging. You're not poking holes in this because it sounds pretty good. And then it leads us to a place like where Ruslan's at here, which is, I haven't really heard of a lot of churches suing. So I bet this isn't really much of anything. It's everything. It's everything to that staff member who feels like they've got litigation threats over their head from a simple conversation 10 years later. Okay. And again, man, I've lived this. Joby, Ruslan, I have lived this. That is terrifying. You got to understand when you're putting that fear there, it's a tool of intimidation. It's just not good.
I'm also like, man, it's not a great look to say, hey, you can't speak on your experience working here.
Yeah, but the other thing is the church can't speak on the experience of that person working there. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's true.
Imagine if I just put on blast why we fired that guy. You know what I mean? But do you know what he said to her?
All right, let's stop there because that is packed with a lot of stuff. Again, if you don't know the questions to ask, it's really easy to say that and disarm someone. And I think that's why Ruslan is laughing and he's going, oh, that's right, because he says, wait, Ruslan says it's not a good look to tell someone they can't tell the truth about their experience. And then Joby comes in and goes, well, we can't tell the truth about what happened with them. Okay. Well, first of all, is that true? I would say it's not. I would say that's false, Joby. And the reason why is because when he says that, a lot of people are going to believe it because they go, oh, yeah, that's right. Because of HR laws and everything else, you can't put somebody on blast and say why you fired them. And a lot of times when you call a company and you're getting references, all they'll do is say, yes, they worked here. And here are the dates because of labor laws. But again, we've already found that churches often don't follow labor laws, okay, because of ecclesiastical abstention and everything else. But I would say this is one of the places where, because of scripture, we have to not follow labor laws, okay? Because the church very clearly can say when they've fired someone for cause in the church, you generally, more often than not, need to tell people. What does scripture say? It says an elder, and in most churches today, we have taken elder to mean pretty much any ordained pastor or staff. And if that's where your church sits, then they've got to apply what the Bible says about elders to them. And it says that a sinning elder should be rebuked in front of the presence of all, okay? You can't rebuke them in front of the presence of all if you're saying we can't legally tell anybody what they did. But there's something more important than that. I want you to listen to this again. I want you to see if you catch it.
The church can't speak on the experience of that person working there. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's true.
Imagine if I just put on blast why we fired that guy. You know what I mean? But do you know what he said to her?
Did you catch it? It was that last part. Could you imagine if we put him on blast and said why we fired that guy? Do you know what he said to her? I'm just going to throw it out there. If there is a guy on your church staff who is saying something to women, could be a volunteer, could be another church staff member, doesn't matter. There's a guy on your church staff that is saying something to women that is so bad that you are firing him, and you don't tell the church about it, you don't tell anybody else about it, and then another church hires them and they're mistreating women in the same way, you are responsible and you are complicit. I would actually say, if that guy is saying something, did you hear what he said to her? If there's a guy on your staff that is saying something to a woman that is a fireable offense, I would actually say you have the scriptural duty to disclose it. You have the scriptural duty to disclose it to the church. You have the scriptural duty to disclose it to the church more broadly so that other churches aren't hiring these people. Think about the amount of news stories you can find on the Roy's Report alone. You can find stories of or articles about pastors who, they abuse people in multiple situations, multiple stops, because one church didn't warn the next church and they didn't turn them in, right? You get all kinds of stuff like that. You find out that, these leaders and pastors are falling, and you find out they've had a history of inappropriate things, and they just grew. Why? Because they continued to get away with it, okay? So the moment he said, could you imagine us talking about why this guy got fired? Could you imagine us getting up and saying, do you know what he said to her? Like, when I heard that, my heart broke, because I hear stories every single day of someone saying something to her that breaks her and causes her trauma for decades. And she is never the same, and she can't look at God the same because someone who said they represented God said that thing to her or did that thing to her. So again, he's being so nebulous here, but I can't think of anything that a male staff member would say to a woman that is so bad it's an egregious, fireable offense that the church wouldn't have a duty to actually disclose it. A sinning elder rebuke in the presence of all. If they don't repent, take it to the church. The Bible is full of it over and over and over again. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And you know what churches are going to say, though, is, we can't do that. And that's, I think, what Joby is saying here. Well, he's trying to say, well, we can't do that, Jeff. We get sued. No, you wouldn't. Because just like we looked at with other churches today, you might get sued, but you get before a court and you would say, we're claiming ecclesiastical abstention, because our Bible tells us right here and right here and right here and right here and right here, it tells us we have to disclose these things to protect our church members, to protect people from being abused. Heck, the Apostle Paul wrote a whole dang letter to a church that was circulated to a bunch of other churches about one guy's sin and why he was kicked out of the church, because the Apostle Paul wasn't worried about those other things. He was worried about protecting someone, and he was worried about that sinner's restoration. All you got to do is say that and say, how are you going to adjudicate this if you're not going to adjudicate doctrine and what the Bible tells me to do? So it's just funny. Churches tend to use ecclesiastical abstention to hide from accountability, but they won't use ecclesiastical abstention to do the right and biblical thing in a lot of cases. I think ecclesiastical abstention is an incredibly important doctrine, legal doctrine that says the church can't adjudicate matters of theology and doctrine and church governance and stuff like that. I think it's an incredibly important doctrine. It's an incredibly important First Amendment issue. But guys, too many churches are using it as a shield against accountability instead of a sword to cut out the cancer of sin among us. We've got to get better. And I just, I don't, maybe it's just me, but I heard that the first time and I get more upset every time I hear it, because that sounds so good and it's so easy to miss. But outside of the untruths about, yes, you actually can tell why they're fired, that's the part that got me. It was do you know what he said to her? Could you imagine me telling the church what he said to her? And honestly, Joby, I can't imagine you not telling the church what he said to her.
So it sounds like you take a more nuanced take on it.
Listen, man, I am not the end all be all here to 1122.
I don't know that it's a more nuanced take. I appreciate some of the things that Joby said. I think Joby's thought about this a lot. I don't think it's a more nuanced take as much as I think there's a lot of excuses here. I think there's a lot of half-truths or true lies. And I think there's either there's excuses to make you feel better about what you're doing, or there's ignorance about what you're doing and how it impacts people. Okay. And I'm just going to assume it's ignorance right now, but I don't think it's a nuanced and complex approach. I think most of this doesn't hold water under scrutiny. Okay. And again, Joby, I'm not trying to throw shade at you, man. Maybe you don't know. Maybe this is literally just ignorance. I didn't know anything about NDAs until my wife was slid one. But I can tell you stories for days and hours. I could probably tell you stories for a month on end about the damage that this has done to people, the damage this has done to God's people in the church. It is not worth using these for these reasons. And again, I just can't get past, man, we can't tell the truth about what these people did. Could you imagine us telling the church what he did to her? It breaks my heart.
I'm the lead pastor. I'm responsible for everything. One day I'll stand before the Lord, give an account.
Yeah.
This is why I have really smart people that work in HR and places like that to help me in areas that I am not.
I'm not the end all be all. That's why I have really smart people who work in HR law and everything like that. This almost feels like an abdication of responsibility, Joby. It is wise to have other wise people around you. But if those other HR people are good at their job, they should have talked to you about McLaren Macomb. They should have talked to you about those broad non-disparagement agreements. If your attorneys are wise people, then they should be telling you about the dangers of these NDAs coming out and how that would make you look bad and how that would potentially do more harm than anything someone could ever say, about the dangers of ending up in litigation, right? They could tell you about that. You would think if your HR people and your attorneys are good and they're actually still learning and looking into the church stuff, they would understand that we've got to deal with sin. But even if they didn't understand it, Joby, that's where you as the pastor have to get in there and say, hey, I don't care if you think someone's going to sue us for saying why we fired this guy. We've got to say why we fired him because he sinned against someone else. He has hurt them. And the Bible requires that we say it to protect people, right? So on one hand, I'm not the end all be all. I'm not the end all be all. I'm going to be responsible for everything. So on one hand, I'm going to be responsible for everything at the end of the day before God. And on the other hand, I hire all these other smart people because I don't know everything that I'm doing. And these smart people are telling me all the things I can do so I can follow the law of the land. Like, it doesn't feel like you're taking that responsibility. And I just don't know, man. I don't know what kind of advice you're getting, Joby. But if the advice you're getting from HR people and lawyers is to these answers, I'm just going to challenge you. You've got bad lawyers and bad HR people. And I would challenge you just on the face of the facts. I don't think they're giving you good advice that helps your church.
Experienced in.
Yeah.
What I want to make sure we do is we shepherd all the folks, especially our staff.
Yeah.
And, sometimes when people's season here ends, then we want to shepherd them through that.
Okay. He says, I want to make sure that we shepherd. I want to make sure that we shepherd people when their season on staff ends. We want to shepherd them there. Man, I appreciate that heart. I think if more pastors had the heart of we want to shepherd people, especially even when they're not on our staff anymore, we don't see that as a fired employee. We see that as a church member who needs to be shepherded into their next season of life until they have another shepherd around them. I think if we did that, we wouldn't be having the conversations about NDAs. We wouldn't be having the conversations about severances. We wouldn't be having the conversations about silencing NDAs and hush money and just, court cases and all this stuff. So that's good. And I'm grateful that Joby said that. My concern is I have a hard time seeing. I just really struggle to see how it's shepherding someone into their next season by saying, the only way we're going to give you this money so that you can put food on the table tomorrow, the only way we're going to allow you to take care of your family is if you say what we want to say and you don't say anything that we don't want you to say. And you got to sign this contract. And if you don't sign this contract, we reserve the right to sue you for all of that money and any reputational damage that we have. Oh, and by the way, as your pastor, I'm going to go on a podcast and I'm going to tell people that people who say these things are disgruntled, that I have concerns about these people's character, and I'm going to villainize all these people. So now if you do this, anybody who's listening to this podcast, any church members who've listened to this podcast, they're going to see you as a villain, right? I just don't see how any of that is shepherding. Actually, Joby, I would see as shepherding, you're so in a relationship with that person that they're sharing their concerns with you and venting all the anger with you before they ever go online. Or maybe they just don't. Maybe they're just so mad that they don't do any of that. They go and they vent online. I would see shepherding as you bringing them back in and you saying, hey, that really hurt. I felt like it was unfair, but at the same time, I know you wouldn't be doing that if you weren't hurt. That means we've hurt you, and I'm so sorry. What can we do to help bring healing? What can we do to help walk you through the season? Right? That to me feels like it would be more shepherding. So I just have a hard time describing this as the shepherding he's talking about.
We are. It's almost dumb how generous we are. Even bro, some dude does something that is clearly scripturally disqualifying, and we fire him. But his wife didn't do that, man.
Yeah.
You know how many people are paying right now for a year?
Yeah.
And their husband completely disqualified himself. But man, he's got kids.
Yeah.
Okay. I do want to stop there, and I want to go ahead and first give props. I think this is awesome, and this is what a church should do as far as taking care of a family, even when somebody's disqualified themselves. Because what he's going to say is, hey, that wife, that kids, that minister that's qualified themselves, their family didn't do that. Let's pay for counseling. Let's make sure that family's taken care of. Even that person who sinned, we might be kind of kicking them out of the church, but we're not just throwing them out on their ear with no way to make ends meet. Let's give them enough money, help them find a job, just to make sure they're taken care of and their kids are okay. That is a good thing. And I want to honor that. I'm grateful that Joby's bringing that up. Okay. At the same time, he's framing this as, man, we're just stupid generous. It's almost dumb how generous we are. Man, we're paying people for years. We're paying people for months, and they disqualified themselves from ministry. They clearly disqualified themselves from ministry. Okay. And again, that is generous when you're taking care of their family and you're taking care of them because you care about the person. However, if that generosity and those years of payments or those months of payments, if they only come by signing an NDA with broad non-disparagement, that is no longer generosity. It's consideration. And actually, this is something I think it's kind of important for people to know. Again, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But I would challenge you that if you say it's generosity and then that contract went before a court, the court would likely void that contract. If you can prove the pastor said it's just generosity, because consideration and generosity are very different, and courts have treated them very different. You can't have a contract that is just, hey, you sign this, and if you do this, I'll do this, and it's just generosity, because if it's just generosity, you'd end up doing it anyway. It has to be consideration. It has to be something I wouldn't normally do outside of this contract. Okay, so the reality is, Joby, and just from a legal standpoint, and again, man, I'm not trying to throw shade. I know there's all kinds of excuses, all kind of fighting we could do. I don't want to do that. But the reality is, from a legal standpoint, it's hard to see, if not impossible to see, how it could be generosity of severance and consideration at the same time. And what you've described up to this point is consideration. If we gave you the money and you took it and signed it, don't talk. That's consideration. Okay. So it's one or the other. It can't be both. And a lot of churches want to frame the severance as generosity while also holding it up as the carrot and the stick. It cannot be both. And churches have to be really careful because, again, churches like to hide behind ecclesiastical abstention as a shield. And at times we need that shield. Again, I think it's a good doctrine. But what a lot of pastors also don't realize is there's precedent for this. Somebody can sue you and ecclesiastical abstention not hold if you've got a contract that you created. Because if you created a contract against the area in question, then you basically gave up your ecclesiastical abstention because you willingly entered into this black and white on paper contract. So again, it would be better if churches want to be protected, separation of church and state, and they want First Amendment protections. It would actually be smart and intelligent not to use NDAs, because a good lawyer could probably at some point bring a case that completely blows up ecclesiastical abstention in an area where NDAs have been used. It's already happened in a couple of small areas with a couple of other cases. So there's some precedent for that. We got to be careful. But again, generosity is good. But if you're trying to call consideration of a contract when the consideration that they give is their silence, if you're trying to call that generosity, that doesn't pass legal snuff. That doesn't pass biblical snuff. It doesn't pass the smell test for anyone with common sense.
And he sinned. Ain't no doubt about it. Or even, it might not even be sin. It might just be stupid. He started down a road that was not above reproach, and we don't put up with it.
All right. And again, hey, it may not be sin. It may just be something that wasn't above reproach, and we don't put up with it. I want to give props to 1122 for not putting up with those shenanigans. At the same time, let's just be clear. If they're a pastor on your staff, a minister, and they're not above reproach, biblically, that's a sin. If you're considering them an elder of any kind, if you're using the biblical passages for elders to explain why pastors should be paid and everything else, which I think they do. And y'all know Ruslan uses those passages. Again, if you're using that, we can't conflate church staff with elders on one hand to talk about why church staff should be paid. And then on the other hand, go, oh, they're not above reproach. They didn't sin. We fired them, but it wasn't sin. Well, no, if they're not above reproach, it is sin. And it's sin that needs to be disclosed, because otherwise another church could hire them as a staff member. Another church could bring them on as a deacon. Another church could bring them on as an elder. And then they're repeating the same unwise things that are hurting people that are disqualified, right? That disqualified them. If we don't disqualify them publicly, they can just go somewhere else, even though we know they're not qualified for ministry. That makes us complicit in that sin. So I just think you got to draw, I appreciate the line that you have drawn, Joby. I think you got to draw a little quicker line with that. Again, it just feels like there's so much here. Do you know what he said to her? We can't talk about that. And we're signing agreements is what it sounds like. And then it's other things like maybe it's not sin, but it's just not above reproach. But then we're not telling anybody that they're not above reproach and they're just moving on to another church. I think you got to wrestle with that biblically a little bit more, because it doesn't seem like that squares to me.
Man, his precious wife.
Yeah.
Bro, she's hurting doubly. So
You rather err on the side of
man, I'm talking about
yeah.
You should, some of our more business-minded elders, you know, they kind of look there like, we're doing what?
Yeah.
This guy did that. I'm like, I understand.
Yeah.
But his wife.
Yeah. I think these are the stories that people don't hear about. And
you can't tell them. There's no place to tell them.
Right.
Like, where are we tell?
Why can't you tell them? I would actually say there's plenty of place to tell them. Hey, this person sinned and they're off our staff because they sinned in a disqualifying way. And biblically, we're supposed to let you know. But we love them, just like Paul still loved the man in Corinth. When he got kicked out of the church, we're praying for his restoration, and we're trying to walk through that restoration with him, just like Paul did with the man in Corinth. Also, we want to let you know, we're not going to give you all the crazy details. We're going to tell you just what we need to tell you. But hey, his wife, his kids, it's not their fault. To show you we care about them and to remind you that we care about people even when they sin, here's what we've done. We give them the severance, no strings attached. And we're doing that to take care of the family. That is what we are doing because we want to be Christ-like. Why can't you tell that story? I would challenge you, you should be telling that story. Because when you don't tell that story, if somebody finds out, I'm just going to be honest, Joby. I have only seen people get paid for years or a year or more in situations where the NDA was silencing. I've never seen it in a place where it was just generous. Now, I hope that exists, okay? And it definitely could exist. But my experience is most of the time when you see big severances, it's because there's something really big you want to hide. And a lot of times, and I'm not saying this is you, Joby, I'm not saying this is 1122, but I've seen a whole lot of pastors who they do that not to be generous and they do that not to protect the person. They do that because if that person's egregious disqualifying sin came out, it would look bad on the church. Paul was not worried about dude's sin in Corinth looking bad on Corinth or looking bad on him. He's worried about restoring a brother. I think that's what we got to worry about.
Tell them. Because we don't want to. I mean, that's fine. We'll just take care of them. Pay for counseling, pay for restoration, pay all these kind of things, man. So we just err on that side.
And again, I think all those things, man, that's good. I think you should err on the side of generosity. I think you should err on the side of compassion. Kind of my last challenge to you, Joby, would just be this. If you're erring on the side of generosity and compassion, and again, you're erring on that side. If I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to make it on that side. I think that leads us to not doing NDAs. Maybe some of the lawyers, some of the HR people, some of my pastor buddies are telling me we should do NDAs because it would protect the church. And I could be making an error by not protecting the church. But if I'm going to err one side or the other, I'm going to err to compassion. I'm going to err to generosity. I'm going to err to shepherding the person, to restoring the person. So I appreciate that you said that. I want to believe that is your heart. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt, man, that is your heart. I just challenge you, if that's your heart, I encourage you the natural next step of that is, man, not to tie severance money to people having to be quiet, not tying it to non-disparagement provisions, not tying it to non-disclosure provisions, not villainizing people who speak out about their experience, man. And again, a lot of this stuff sounds good. And man, I've heard stuff that sounds good. I've heard parts of Joby's heart that I think are awesome. But Joby, you got to realize you're the one with the most power in this situation. Nobody has more power at Church of 1122 than you do. You're kind of the end. You said you're not the end all be all, but you kind of are as far as decision making goes in a lot of these ways. You have the power. The church has the most power money wise. These staff members, when they leave, have the least amount of power out of anybody. And there's such an unbalanced power dynamic. So again, I would encourage you. I think the last thing you said is spot on. It's the way you need to go, though. You need to go farther. If you're going to err on the side of generosity, err on the side of compassion, because you're the Goliath and behemoth with all the power to just this little person who feels like they have no power, right? Err on the side of generosity and compassion. I think it will go a long way. But again, guys, I would encourage you to listen to that whole interview. I'm probably going to talk about a few other things from that interview over the next couple of months. I'm not going to, force them in, but I think Ruslan did a good job with that interview. I think there's good things, there's concerning things. There's a lot of things that Joby talked about as a giga church pastor that I think are important for us to talk about. Going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think he loves Jesus. I think he loves people. He's leading a huge church, which is difficult. It's hard. And you take a lot of shrapnel, you can get really calloused, and that callousness, the shrapnel that you've taken in the past, the wounds that you had can lead to things like NDAs really easily. But I think Ruslan did a good job of asking good questions. The questions just, my two biggest concerns this interview. One, Joby didn't answer all the questions directly. That's always concerning. Like, hey, let's answer the questions directly. But the bigger thing is Joby gave a lot of answers that I've heard a lot. So he didn't come up with a lot of these answers. He's heard them from other people as well. So, and he probably believes them because he's probably heard them from people for decades, that he's close to in ministry, people that he, looks up to in ministry, right? So I don't think a lot of pastors are even doing this bad, and they're not doing it just to hurt people. They didn't wake up one day and go, I want to hurt people with NDAs. They've just lived in this world that has told them this is okay and given them these excuses and these reasons and the rationale, and it sounds good. And a lot of it even sounds good as Joby says it, right? But the issue is it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And unfortunately, most of the time, these pastors are only talking to each other and nobody's ever scrutinizing what they're doing. So even though I disagree with Joby on some of these things, even though I've challenged him a lot on his answers, I'm really grateful, Joby, that you sat down. If you ever watch this, and I'm going to reach out to you, man, I'm going to reach out to Church of 1122. I want to talk to you about the Safe Church Pledge. If you're willing to show me the severance agreements that you guys are using, I will free at no charge, give you advice, and I won't share the information if you're willing to show it. I'll just give you advice on, hey, this is what I would do to make it safe, right? Because, man, at the end of the day, we just want people to be safe. We want churches to be safe. We want y'all to be safe. You want you to be safe. So I'm not throwing shade at you at all, man, but I would encourage you that some of the questions Ruslan asked, they open up other lines of thinking. I hope you're hearing this, and I hope that maybe for the first time, you're thinking about this a little bit more holistically, because I don't have to just think about this as an HR person. I don't have to just think about this as an attorney. I don't have to just think about this as a podcaster. I don't have to just think about this as a pastor. I don't have to just think about this as a person who has been on church staff. I don't have to just think about this as a person who's been given an NDA. And I don't have to just think about this through the stories that I've heard. I can bring all of that into it and say, I think there's a better way. I think the better way is either don't use NDAs or only use them to protect parishioners. And again, if you're going to do it to protect parishioners, I can give you a really good case for a front end NDA. But again, thank you for sitting down with Ruslan. Thank you for talking about this. If more pastors were having public conversations like this, it opens up more nuanced discussion around the concerns, like the concerns I had today. And I think it can lead us to a better place. But at the end of the day, the ball's going to be in the church's court, the pastor's court. In this case, what happens at 1122 with their NDAs and in a lot of the churches that look up to Joby and respect Joby and listen to Joby, it's going to be determined by what Joby decides to do. So if you would join me, I'm praying for Joby. I hope that you would be praying for Joby. It's really easy sometimes for us to look at these big church pastors and just go, here's all my concerns and man, all the things I disagree with them about. And it's easy just to almost see them as a caricature and as a wolf in your head. But man, I'm trying to get better at just praying for them, reaching out to them, doing everything I can, because man, when the Lord moves in these pastors' hearts, it changes these churches. And when him moving in these pastors' hearts is changing giga churches and mega churches across the country, man, it's a huge deal. Because I just saw a thing where it looks like Joby was preaching at Life Church a week or two ago. You guys know we've done articles on Life Church and their NDA use, and I've got a lot of the same concerns with both of them. I've heard a lot of the same excuses from both of them. Man, if Craig Rochelle and Joby Martin both just said, it's not worth it to use these NDAs, there's a better way. Could you imagine how that would impact churches across the country? So I pray for Craig Rochelle. I pray for Joby Martin. And when I pray for them, man, I get more of a burden for the church to be safe, but that burden doesn't come with the anger. It doesn't come with the vitriol that maybe I felt when I first got that NDA in my own hands, right? So if you ever feel like you're angrier than you want to be, man, I pray for the people. Pray for the people involved in this, because I want my heart to break for what breaks God's heart. I want to be passionate about reform in the church, man. I want to be passionate about protecting people. I want to give all my work and all my effort to it, but I don't want to be angry and controlled by my anger. I know we need some righteous indignation, but that's something I'm just finding that's helped me balance it right now, and I would encourage you to do that. So, Joby, if you're listening, man, I'm praying for you. I appreciate you. Like in that interview, one thing that he said that's not here, he was praying for Ruslan and prays for Ruslan when he's hears his intro and stuff like that. And man, I'm praying for you, and I'm praying that God will show you, Joby, how it feels to people on the other side when they get that NDA. Because I think if you could just feel, not walk a day in their shoes, I think if you could just feel a day in their shoes, if you could feel a day in their soul, I just don't think you'd use an NDA again. I don't think it'd be worth it, but that's my hope. So, Joby, thanks for answering the questions for Ruslan. Ruslan, thank you for asking the questions and giving me a heads up that was part of the interview. And thank you guys for listening. That's all for today. I hope this has helped encourage you. I hope this helped you to think differently. And hopefully there's some stuff here that you're wrestling with for the next little bit as you walk away from this podcast, because there's a lot here. And I think we do well to wrestle with it. But that's all I got for you today. Until the next one, grace and peace. I love you guys, and I'll see you soon. All right. That's it for that one. Let me go ahead and check the chat. I know we've had some different people joining us today. We had Abby and Shaman Way join us earlier. Looks like Nautica joined us. Says first thing that came to my mind when I heard was, imagine if Jesus gave Judas an NDA. Yeah. When you start thinking about Jesus giving people NDAs and Paul giving people NDAs, man, it doesn't fit within the narrative of Scripture. And I think that's something that we can look at when it would feel so foreign in Scripture, not just because we're looking at the first century, versus now, but just it would feel so foreign in what you're doing, trying to silence someone. Like Paul was pretty open about his disagreements and his concerns and people who he thought were sinning, even with being open with his rebuke of Peter. So yeah, I think that's pretty eye-opening. Katie says, my question with the NDAs has always been, what are you so afraid of them saying? It's against the law for them to lie and defame you with lies, but if they're telling the truth, what are you afraid of? And Katie, I agree with that. That's something that Ruslan and I talked about on our interview about NDAs a year ago, probably a little more than a year ago now. Was I said we already have laws for defamation, laws against defamation. So churches are protected by those laws. Non-disparagement is just moving from, we're trying to keep you from saying false things to hurt us, to we don't want you to say true things that could hurt us. And I think anytime we're trying to fight against the truth coming out, that's a dangerous proposition. I think it's an unbiblical proposition. So yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's a place where I've landed. Why are you doing this? What are you afraid of? Man, even going to the Bible says that we're supposed to embrace truth, right? The truth, man, truth will set you free, but it also says that God didn't give us a spirit of fear. So what are you afraid of? Where's that spirit of fear coming from? I don't think it's coming from the Lord. Sprinkle Color says, what constitutes mistreatment at a church? I mean, a lot of things could constitute mistreatment at a church. A lot of times what we're talking about is mistreatment at churches. We're talking about spiritual abuse. If you go to spiritualabuse.institute under the resources tab, we've actually got a checklist that has over 20 of the most common signs of spiritual abuse. That would be a good place to start to answer that question. But mistreatment could go well beyond that. So I could spend probably hours just naming off different mistreatment examples. So hopefully that helps, and I'll help you kind of to figure out where to go with that. Says again, wherever anything is mentioned about possible hurt, I always have they have a spirit of offense. Yeah, that's a common one, sprinkled with color. I would encourage you, gosh, I think it was last summer. So it's going to be quite a few videos ago. You could probably search John Bevere in Church Disrupted or Spirit of Offense, Church Disrupted. But I actually walked through a biblical rebuttal to that Spirit of Offense teaching that John Bevere does, and just talked about why it doesn't hold water spiritually, because it is used a lot. You're totally right. A lot of people say, it's there's just spirit of offense, and they use it just to shut you down. When you understand what a spirit of offense is biblically, it really changes the way that you see things. Nautica says, yeah, the church villainizes in a majority of situations when they're questioned or challenged. I don't know if it's a majority of situations, but it happens often. It is way too common, a whole lot of villainization. That's something that I'm hoping that we see a whole lot less of. Nautica says church elders and leaders are not approachable in a lot of church environments. They have their secret service agents because they're like rock stars and people talk on social media and other areas. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's all of them. I don't know if that's most of them, but I've seen it a lot, Nautica. So I just resonate with the concerns that you have because I've seen it a ton. Sprinkle without water says, how can my family be a part of such a huge family, yet be completely invisible, ignorable, unappreciated, uncalled, and unloved? Man, that is heavy. That's heavy. That's a heavy question. It's a good question. Thank you for being so transparent with us. Sprinkle with color. Says, I've hurt my teen daughter by bringing her every week to be hurt. I think if you feel that way in a church, I would encourage you. It's time to step out and find another church. If you're being hurt, if your family's being hurt by going, man, that's not the church. If you go back and you look at our Deconstructing the Church teaching, where we talked about what's the purpose of the church, Paul said the purpose of the church is edification. And while edification can hurt sometimes, edification means to be built up. So even when there's pain in being built up, you should actually leave better than when you came. And if you're not being edified, I think it's time to leave. If you're actively being hurt, it's definitely time to leave. When your family, especially like a minor that you're taking, when they're being hurt, I think it's your duty to leave, as hard as that is. In every city, you're going to find some good churches. You're never going to find a perfect church, but you're going to find some really good churches, and then you're going to find some stinkers. But I don't think God wants you to be a part of a body where you feel like you're being attacked and where you feel that way every time. So praying for you, Sprinkle with Color. I don't know what you're going through, but praying for you there. And again, I don't know what the hurt is. I know, we can have some pain when someone confronts us about sin. We can have some pain when people, rebuke us or try to hold us accountable. But even that pain, it should be different because we know we're being edified and we know we're being built up. Chrissy says, just joining, won't be commenting here since I'm so late, but wanted to say hi. Thank you, Chrissy, for joining us today. Nautica, when I keep hearing protecting the church, who or what is the church? Nautica, I don't know if you got a chance to hear any of our Deconstructing the Church series, but that's what we started out that series with, is the question, what is the church? What does the Bible mean when it says the church? So I would really encourage you to dive into that. I think we talked for like an hour and a half, 2 hours on just what the Bible says about church. And when we get the biblical answer to that question, I don't think we feel like we have to protect the church anymore. I feel like when we think we have to protect the church, we're thinking of a building, or we're thinking of an institution, or a corporation, or a small group of leaders. I think when we see the church as the biblical entity, protecting it looks different. Protecting it actually looks like, just like I talked about with Joby, protecting it doesn't look like not saying what that guy said to her. All of a sudden, protecting the church looks like letting the people know so that they're protected. So, Chrissy answering Nautica says the church is the people, the sheep, the body. what many call the church is just a building with a high overhead. More times than not, it's a corporation. The Bible tells us that God resides not in a building that was built by hands, but yeah, he resides in us. And again, just to give you a quick overview of kind of where we landed in the Deconstructing the Church series on what is the church. When the Bible talks about the church, the Bible is really talking about three things. Sometimes it's talking about the universal church, which is every believer everywhere for all time. The most common discussion of the church when the Bible talks about the church is it's talking about a group of believers in a city. So like the church in Knoxville, Tennessee, the church in Denver, Colorado, wherever you're at, the church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, kind of like that. So it's a region of believers and the body in that region. And then sometimes the Bible actually talks about specific church gatherings. So the church that meets in Phoebe's house, the church that meets in Priscilla and Aquila's house, the church that meets here, that meets there, the church that meets in your house, their house, that kind of thing, right? Those are the only discussions the Bible has about the church. So whether it's the universal church or the gathering in one place, it's always a group of believers. It's never about a building, never about an institution, never about a corporation, never about a leader. That just changes how we see things. So anyway, guys, I think what we'll do, man, I really wanted to get to the next part of deconstructing the church today because the sacraments is something I really want to talk about, but taking a little longer to get through the NDA stuff than I wanted, and I don't want to keep you guys for forever on the live stream. So I think I'm just going to have to prioritize it. That's what we're going to start with next time so that we get it done. I keep kind of hanging it toward the end because I want to give it time, but then sometimes time is actually running out. So we'll try to make sure that we get to that. That is going to be a fantastic conversation when we get to it. And I know it's probably been about a month since we put out another piece of that series. We got a lot more coming. June was just kind of crazy with some time off and vacations and everything like that. But anyway, I'm locked in, buckled in, want to share it with you. I think probably the topic that caused the most cognitive dissonance with me over time was actually the sacraments topic. Really asking the question, what did a first century Christian hear when they heard baptism, when they heard communion? It's probably either that or what did a first century Christian hear when they heard about discipleship and making disciples? What did that mean for them? Both of those are coming up on the Deconstructing the Church series. So those will be coming out soon. And we'll try to have these out as standalone videos. So if you want to share the NDA interview reaction, or if you want to share the stuff talking about Gateway, those are going to be out as standalone. The NDA part's going to be out as a standalone episode of the podcast. The Gateway stuff will be out as a standalone video. Those will both be coming soon. So if you want to share those, just look for that standalone video that is coming. But again, guys, thanks so much for joining us. That's it for today. I think we made it all the way through the chat. So if I don't see you guys before then, I'll see you on a stream next Wednesday. Love you guys. Grace and peace, and I'll see you soon.